Oh, yeah.
The committee will now come to order. Today, we will proceed with consideration of the fiscal year 2025 concurrent resolution on the budget. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Boyle, for working with me to develop a structure for this markup that closely follows what has been done in the recent past with our last budget resolution and last debate in markup in that regard. Our goal is to have a markup in which both sides will have the opportunity to debate the framework for the fiscal year 25 concurrent budget resolution. I thank everyone for their cooperation. Consistent with the agreement that I've reached with my friend Mr. Boyle, without objection, the ranking member, Mr. Boyle, and I will each have 5 minutes to make opening statements. Members will each be recognized for 3-minute statements. Members have 7 days to submit additional statements for the record. The document will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The amendments considered by the committee will be those submitted pursuant to the agreement I made with Mr. Boyle. The debate time for each amendment will be limited to 10 minutes. Debate time will be equally divided between the sponsor of the amendment and a member opposed. And to accommodate floor votes later today, the chairman is authorized to declare recess at any time, and the committee to roll any requests for a roll call vote. I would like to thank everyone for joining us here today, and the people watching on their television sets. I sound like I'm from the 80s or 70s. Back at home, dozens of you glued to your TVs, and what we're going to say, I hope you are, because what we're going to say is important, and what we're doing here is important as we comply with the 1974 Congressional Budget Act in considering this resolution. We talk about the budget process. Well, the first part of integrity and consistency in compliance with this process is to put forward and mark up a budget resolution. Today, we will consider this resolution. I'm proud to report that the passage of the resolution today, and I presume it will pass, will mark just the second time in history that the Budget Committee will pass a budget resolution before the President releases his budget. And since 1994, there's only been one other year that the Budget Committee passed a budget resolution earlier than we did today. That's the bar I'm setting for you, ranking member, for future leadership. And I thank all my members for their cooperation in that endeavor. Now I yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, President Biden will try to convince the American people that the State of the Union is good and that our lives are better. For the sake of our country, I wish it were so, but unfortunately, it couldn't be further from the truth. After 3 years of one self-inflicted crisis after another, President Biden will not only not be able to suspend reality, he won't be able to convince the American people of his words because of his recent actions. The American people just know better. Under the failed leadership of President Biden, their country has become weaker and more vulnerable, both at home and abroad. Americans know they are much less safe and secure today than they were 3 years ago. Record violent crime has ripped through our once great American cities. Record illegal immigration, bringing record drugs, crime, criminals, flows of migrants, record migrant deaths, all the while costing taxpayers upwards of $200 billion a year. On top of that, the world's become more destabilized. Our adversaries are emboldened, our allies are being threatened, costing taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, and more importantly, America's respect and leadership in the world. Americans know they have less money in their pocket, a lower standard of living, and little hope that their economic future will improve. Why? Record spending and borrowing to the tune of $6 trillion over the last 3 years has put our nation at the highest levels of indebtedness in our 250-year history, surpassing World War II, resulting in record inflation, record interest rates, a cost of living crisis that's crushing our working Americans. It's no surprise that Moody's and Fitch credit rating agencies have downgraded not only our credit rating, but our fiscal and economic outlook along with it. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are irrefutable. Our deficit spending is out of control, our national debt's unsustainable, and the fiscal state of the union is in rapid decline. Today, while President Biden talks about the State of the Union, Republicans on the Budget Committee today here in this room are taking action to revive the fiscal state of our union by passing our fiscal year 25 budget resolution, a budget blueprint to restore fiscal responsibility by reining in spending, reigniting economic growth, and putting our nation on a path to balance. This fiscal framework will balance the budget in 10 years by reducing deficit spending by a little over $14 trillion and reducing the debt to GDP by 40 points. We achieve these savings without cutting Medicare, Social Security, and veterans' benefits. Instead, we propose our recently passed bipartisan fiscal commission to find consensus solutions to strengthening and saving these important safety net programs while addressing our $120 trillion long-term unfunded liability. Here's our plan. First, we right-size the bloated bureaucracy that's grown 40% since COVID, hundreds of billions of dollars. The FRA was a good step, but there are hundreds of billions of dollars in unnecessary and wasteful spending in that part of our budget. Next, we reverse President Biden's spending spree, student loan bailouts, hundreds of billions of dollars, expanding welfare without work, and then many of the provisions of the IRA, including 87,000 IRS agents, green corporate energy tax subsidies, expanded Obamacare to people making over $500,000, unnecessary, wasteful, and not the mission of the federal government. Third, we rein in runaway mandatory spending through entitlement reforms. These are the debt drivers. Mandatory spending makes up 73% of our budget today. In 10 years, CBO says it'll be 80%, but it represents 90% of our growth in spending. We must address it if we want to reverse the curse of a debt crisis. Fourth, we root out rampant waste and fraudulent spending. According to GAO, that's over $2 trillion. Fifth, we reignite growth and prosperity by locking in lower taxes, by rolling back the barrage of expensive and unnecessary regulations, unleash American energy independence, and get back to America First trade policies. Look, we all know our current fiscal trajectory is unsustainable and the catastrophic and irreparable harm that will come to this country if we fail to act. The only other time in American history that our debt to GDP or our nation's indebtedness has been this high was in the aftermath of World War II. We were not only able to recover from that, but the United States emerged as the world's only superpower. The greatest generation inherently understood their moral obligation to, as George Washington stated in his farewell address, not ungenerously throw upon posterity the burden of debt which we ourselves ought to bear. The greatest generation had a simple strategy, but not an easy one. They persisted in the difficult task of reducing government spending and unleashing economic growth. Friends on both sides of the aisle, if we demonstrate that same sense of urgency, persistence, and political courage, we will preserve America's leadership in the world and secure the blessings of liberty for our children. But if we don't, we will be the first of our nation's leaders to leave the next generation not with a better and brighter future, but with a worse and weaker country than we ourselves inherited. A public debt is indeed a public curse, and we must reverse it. With that, I yield to my ranking member 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back with you today. Frankly, there is no debate. America's economy today is the strongest in the world. Here are the indisputable facts. Under President Biden, nearly 15 million jobs have been created. That's 5.5 million more jobs than the pre-pandemic peak. In 2023, we added an average of 250,000 jobs every single month. And last year, the percentage of working-age women in the workforce reached the highest level since the 1940s. The stock market is reaching all-time highs, and Americans have applied to create 16 million new businesses in just the last 3 years. Wages are now growing faster than inflation, and inflation has fallen from a peak of 9.1% to now 3.1%. None of this happened by accident. It happened because Democrats took action to rescue our economy, invest in American manufacturing, rebuild our infrastructure, lower health insurance costs, and finally let Medicare negotiate lower prescription drug prices. Those are the facts, and again, they are indisputable. While President Biden and congressional Democrats have delivered an economy that is the envy of the world, Republicans have turned the House of Representatives into an embarrassment. The do-nothing chaos caucus driving the wheel of the House Republican Conference will talk a big game about the border, but then refuse to actually put the bipartisan border legislation on the floor. They will complain about inflation, but then do nothing to lower costs for families. As a member of this very own committee asked recently on the House floor, what exactly are the achievements of this Republican majority? Being the first to depose their own speaker? Impeaching a cabinet member over policy disagreements? How does that help the American people? The answer, of course, is it doesn't. And the theme of abandoning the American people continues throughout this budget being put forward today. This MAGA budget is an assault on everything from health care to education. It would strip funding for food assistance for those in need, attack Medicaid, and make indiscriminate cuts to many government programs upon which Americans rely. Whether it's making it harder to put food on the table or keep shelter over your head, this budget does plenty of harm. And it does this all while paving the way for an extension of the Trump tax cuts, 83% of which went to the richest 1%. So let's be clear, this budget is extreme. Putting food assistance and Pell Grants for low-income students on the chopping block while extending tax cuts for billionaires is extreme. Selling out working families to line the pockets of price-gouging corporations while making it easier for the rich to cheat on their taxes is extreme. Not a single Republican joined Democrats to cap insulin prices for seniors and lower health insurance costs for millions. Instead, they support this budget that attacks the progress we have made under President Biden. I would add, even after trillions of dollars in draconian cuts they make to programs that help the most in need, this Republican budget still doesn't balance. In order to achieve that, they jettison the assumptions of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and other reputable sources to rely on astonishing predictions of economic growth that somehow creates $3 extra trillion out of thin air. So that's where we are here today. Saying we're here to talk about how Republicans want to fund the government for the next decade would be charitable. We're here to talk about how Republicans plan to take away health care from millions of Americans. We're here to talk about how Republicans plan to cut funding that gives our children a better future. And Democrats are here to say we completely reject this bleak and backwards budget and all of its misplaced priorities. We will proudly offer a series of amendments today that protect American families from reckless GOP cuts, defend Social Security and Medicare, and preserve the historic climate investments of the Inflation Reduction Act. This budget is a roadmap to making life worse, not better, for middle-class families. We need a vision that looks to the future, not the past, and thankfully, we will get to hear that vision when President Biden addresses the nation tonight. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I say this. After the historic progress we have made over the last 3 years, this is no time to turn back the clock and end it all. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from Pennsylvania, and now we'll recognize members for their opening statements and yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from the Palmetto State, Mr. Ralph Norman, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you for putting forth this conservative budget that will finally put in print something that we have not been able to do for the last 4, 5 years, or even more. You know, if you and I buy a toaster, it starts with putting it on paper. And the fact that you're doing this is admirable. What we're facing now and why this is so important is we've got a out-of-control Biden administration that, let me just list a few of the things that they have done and have caused: invasion at the border. We've got out-of-control crime. We have out-of-control gas prices, from eggs to construction lumber to everything else in this country, no reductions at all. Out-of-control supply chain shortages, out-of-control wars in the Middle East, a military that has been weakened by this administration and this administration alone. His position is to appease, even if it means the death of Americans, as we've seen, starting off with the Americans left behind in Afghanistan, and with the over 110 attacks from Iran on our military in the Middle East, resulting in deaths. The priorities of this administration are to make America weak. The priorities of this administration is to promote, instead of our military to keep us safe, to promote priorities such as transgender surgeries, climate dollars that'll go to their friends and their allies on their side of the aisle. Out-of-control executive orders that are wrecking this country. Most notably, Alaska has 55 executive orders that we found out yesterday that's basically trying to paralyze that state, who's got got oil reserves that are second to none all across this world. So this budget gives us a template to stop this out-of-control spending, and gives us a template to go by for other elected officials to follow. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for what you've done, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. Now yield 3 minutes to our friend from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your yeoman effort. I just disagree with the direction, although I appreciate your concern about debt. I'm sorry that we're not focusing on areas where we could cut spending, like ships that don't work and the Navy doesn't want, the abominable situation of military housing. This is a missed opportunity. But the picture that is painted is wildly at variance with reality. You talk about dangerous. Alabama has a murder rate 3 times New York City. Texas is 50% higher. An unstable world? Well, unstable because a Republican minority has refused to be able to support our valiant allies in Ukraine that are fighting for our freedom and their lives. And it's still hung up. I find that appalling and embarrassing. And you should too. The world is actually more stable in terms of what the American has done. We have the strongest economy of any developed country, and that's a fact. Any independent expert will agree with that. Now, part of the problem here is that we don't want to appease the murderous Putin and the outrageous assault on our allies. Now, our economy has been downgraded because you've refused to stand up to a small minority of your members who have pursued policies that are destabilizing. And that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the economic performance. They're talking about the inability of this Congress to deliver on its responsibilities because you have been held hostage by a small minority of your members. I don't think most of you actually believe in that. I don't think most of you want to sell out Ukraine. I don't think most of you really support that activity. I wait for you to break through, to be able to agree with that, and we can deal with some areas that we agree with. I've talked about military spending, waste in the agricultural sector, things that should be bipartisan. But dreaming up non-existing facts, denying reality, and catering to the most extreme members of your congressional folks isn't helping us. It's dividing us, it's making us weaker, and it doesn't have to be that way. I appreciate your efforts to try and focus on the debt. That's something that I appreciate and we can do something about. But living in this economic fantasy land doesn't advantage it. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his willingness to work on a bipartisan basis with respect to the Fiscal Commission. And I also want to associate myself with his comments about waste at the Pentagon, waste at USDA and in farm bills, and I will be an equal opportunity waste cutter alongside of you, Mr. Blumenauer, my friend. With that, I'd like to give 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Tom McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rome fell for many reasons, but one of the most prominent was the collapse of its economy under the weight of many decades of reckless and ruinous spending. History warns us that nations that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long because before they can provide for the common defense or promote the general welfare, they have to be able to pay for them. And with interest costs now exceeding our entire defense budget, that catastrophe is now facing our nation in our time. Just as you cannot drink yourself sober, you also cannot borrow your way out of debt or spend your way rich or tax your way to prosperity, yet the socialists keep trying. We have to recognize these simple truths or we're going to lose our country. The federal budget, so long neglected by the Congress, is the only way to do so. Now, I don't need to dwell on how dire our situation is. Suffice it to say that socialism hasn't worked any better here than everywhere else in the world has been tried because, as Margaret Thatcher famously warned, they keep running out of other people's money. And I would remind the ranking member who tells us that everything is great, that when Donald Trump left office, gasoline cost $2.39 a gallon, inflation was 1.4%, a 30-year mortgage cost 1.9%, America was energy independent, and our borders were secure. And the ultimate question that will decide this issue will be asked of the American people, and it's a simple one. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? But more importantly, I want to speak of the budget process itself. This is not a theoretical discussion, and the budget is not an aspirational document, as so many past and failed budget chairs have wrongly stated. The Budget Act is, in fact, the single most powerful and practical fiscal tool that Congress has because it encompasses the entire federal spending plan and provides us with effective means to control spending if we choose to use it. The budget sets limits on both discretionary and mandatory spending. Discretionary limits bind the Appropriations Committee and forbid those levels from being exceeded. Mandatory limits bind the authorizing committees and command them to produce the statutory reforms necessary to fit within those limits. Either the authorizing committees act and their work's put into the Reconciliation Act, or else the Budget Committee acts in their place. The appropriations bills and the Reconciliation Act then go to the Senate, they're modified there, and the differences are resolved in conference. The last time this process was followed, it produced the only 4 balanced budgets our country has seen in more than half a century. Let us pray that we can do so again and that it's not too late to avert the fiscal disaster that awaits us if we fail. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California and yield to my friend, Mr. Jimmy Panetta, also from California, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off by associating myself with Ranking Member Boyle's comments in regards to the status of the economy and what is going on right now in our country, in the sense of where we're at as the leading economy in the Western world with the lowest inflation rate of any Western economy. Obviously, we're going to hear about that tonight in the President's State of the Union, but it obviously has to be, there has to be more said by our President. I admit that when it comes to what the people are feeling, despite the economy being so well for them. And it's a question of whether people are going to be voting with their heads, or their wallets, or their guts, to be frank. And I think it's going to be up to this president to talk about everything that we've done, which has been a tremendous amount, and that is going to be the foundation upon which we're not going to be asking people to reward the president, but I think it's clear that you can trust the president to do the right thing going forward. And I think that's the message that we're going to hear, especially based on what this administration and last Congress have done. Now, also, Mr. Chairman, as I did in September, let me begin my remarks by commending you for offering a budget resolution and working to get us back on track. I'm particularly thankful that we're doing this early in the year and attempting to adhere to a more regular timeline. So thank you for your efforts to restore the norms of congressional budgeting, which will improve the budget process overall. We certainly don't want to repeat a fiscal year 24 spending, which we will pass nearly 6 months late. These types of delays, as you know well, create uncertainty, which leads to more inefficiency and spending waste. Now, I also want to again thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work on the Bipartisan Fiscal Commission and for including this in the budget resolution. I do believe that a commission would be able to put out a bipartisan product that can both increase revenues and carefully control spending growth to improve our fiscal outlook. I'm still very hopeful that we can get this important legislation passed this Congress. That being said, this budget resolution, though, is unfortunately not a bipartisan proposal. You know that, Mr. Chairman. And I have many of the same concerns with the details of this resolution that I expressed last year. While we made progress in ensuring that fiscal year 25 budget complies with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the steep cuts down the line are very concerning. So, Mr. Chairman, realizing that I'm under a time constraint, please know that I'm hopeful that in the future we can put forth a budget resolution with a more bipartisan input that better realizes the need for revenues and less reliant on spending cuts alone. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. I want to especially thank him for his leadership on the Bipartisan Fiscal Commission. Ultimately, that long-term unfunded liability is only going to be solved when both parties get together and find consensus solutions. Again, thanks for your leadership, Jimmy. I want to now yield 3 minutes to Mr. Ben Klein, who is also not just a Budget Committee member, but the chairman of the RSC Budget Task Force. Mr. Klein, 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your leadership in getting this important budget marked up in committee ahead of time this year and ahead of our president even releasing a budget. Passing a budget this early in the process would mark the first step of the many that will be required in the FY25 process to hold Congress and the administration accountable and adhere to responsible spending levels. With each year that Congress drags its feet on addressing our $34 trillion debt crisis, the more painful it will be to resolve. In fact, recent research conducted by the Economic Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC, would suggest that the federal government will begin running out of its capacity to take on additional debt to deal with national security threats and challenges within the next 15 years. This year alone, the cost of interest payments will be our nation's second largest expenditure, exceeding that of Medicare and our entire military. That's why, especially as the president paints an excessively rosy picture about the economy and the state of our union, that it really is little more than fantasy this evening, this committee is being galvanized into action. While there is room for improvement in this budget to cut further, this plan would achieve balance in 10 years and includes consensus-driven policies that eliminate budget gimmicks, lock in the Trump-era tax cuts, repeal Biden's student loan bailout, rescind $250 billion in Green New Deal corporate welfare from the IRA, reduce wasteful improper payments, which have exceeded $247 billion in recent years, support work requirements to reduce welfare dependency, and strengthen Medicare for seniors. Following this plan would reduce deficits by $14 trillion over the next decade and create a $44 billion surplus at the end of our budget window, all while fostering the kind of economic environment that will spur the actual growth in our nation's economy that we need, and not just the talk that we will hear from our president this evening. With that, I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Virginia. Yes, and then I'm going to yield to Mrs. Barbara Lee from California. I'm sorry, I got a little confused here. I yield 3 minutes to you, Mrs. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member. And I, too, want to associate myself with the remarks of our ranking member and just say a couple of things about this budget. First of all, or a budget. This budget may not be aspirational, or any budget may not be aspirational, but it is a moral document and a reflection of our nation's values. Sadly, Republicans' proposed budget once again confirms that they are deeply out of step with the priorities of people in America. We haven't even passed a fiscal 2024 spending bills, not all of them at least, until, excuse me, as we propose this budget for 2025 that would actually harm our most vulnerable communities. It'll rip away critical benefits, protect the wealthy from paying their fair share of taxes, and increase our bloated Pentagon budget. This budget is extreme. It's a GOP extreme budget, and it fails to deliver on this country's top priorities, which of course is tackling climate change, furthering racial equity, which is extremely important. I believe that Republicans would think so at least, expanding health care affordability and accessibility, creating good-paying jobs, and lowering everyday costs. While Republicans are making cuts left and right, they won't cut where it matters the most. The Department of Defense failed its sixth audit, mind you, failed its sixth audit in a row last year. But instead of using their power to address the fraud, waste, and abuse within the Pentagon, Republicans in Congress are once again giving them a blank check. If we cut just $100 billion from the defense budget, like my People Over Pentagon Act would do, we could redirect funding to meet so many of our needs in our communities and, yes, reduce the deficit. Reallocating these funds from the Pentagon could power every household in the United States with solar energy, hire 1 million elementary school teachers amid a worsening teacher shortage, provide free tuition for 2 out of 3 public college students, or cover medical care for 7 million veterans. This is what a document such as a budget would reflect if, in fact, we saw it as a moral document and as one reflecting our values. I'm very disappointed that in this extreme GOP budget proposal, it would deepen poverty and increase hardships for working families nationwide. And so I cannot in good conscience vote for a budget that puts profits and politics over people, and that's what this budget is doing, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady from California, and now yield 3 minutes to my friend, Mr. Blake Moore, our deputy chair of the GOP conference from Utah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chairman. I got a question in a recent town hall from a lady from Cache County, Utah, northern part of the state. After giving many slides about our fiscal situation, she basically just raised her hand and said, "Congressman, do you have any hope?" And I looked at her and I smiled, knowing that we were doing this today. And I said, the minute I don't have hope was the minute I will step down. And I will let someone else come back here and continue on. But I'm full of hope. It's treacherous when you look at the numbers and you look at the projections going forward on all things budgetary. Yeah, it's bleak. But I know that we're in two things. I know as a majority on the House Budget Committee, we're united. We're united in being able to find solutions to the realities that we face. And I wish it would have been more bipartisan, but I am so encouraged by the handful of my Democratic colleagues, and I know many more probably were hoping to vote for. We believe we can actually go after our debt issues too in the Fiscal Commission Act. Those things give me hope, and I'm trying to communicate that to my constituents back home that we can do something. Our nation had gone always 10, 15 years, and they would find a way to get back to a balanced budget, and we would have something happen or this or that. We're at a different situation now, right? This isn't World War II, post-World War II, where we can just lower defense spending completely and get our debt to GDP to 20%. We're in a different world now, and that's why we have to make tough decisions. This resolution that we're doing today is just giving us all hope, and I am so thrilled to be able to put this on paper. and to be able to vote for it and to show that we have a plan to continue to grow our economy. Because I get it. I understand that we have to have our different talking points at a certain particular piece of policy. But we doubled the child tax credit. We doubled the standard deduction. We didn't create inflation with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And we grew middle-class wages. Quit calling it a tax benefit for the wealthy. It's not. It grows our economy, so we have a fighting chance to be able to overcome our massive deficits and our ballooning debt. That's irrefutable, too. Those are irrefutable facts. And I'm thrilled to be able to put on paper the spending cuts that we need to do, along with the ability to continue to grow our economy. Because yes, we do have a strong economy, and it is our only hope to be able to tackle this. And we have a strong economy because we encourage industry, businesses to stay in America and not leave overseas with massive tax hikes. This plan that we have today gives us that fighting chance, and that's why I have hope to go back to Cache County and say, yes, I do have hope, and we have a chance to do this, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Utah and now yield 3 minutes to Ms. Ballant from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to say I very much appreciate the remarks of the ranking member, and I always appreciate, Mr. Chair, your push to try to keep this committee centered in thinking about the people we represent back home and trying to create an environment in the committee where we are trying to have a conversation with each other and not just hurling insults at each other. So I had prepared remarks, but I'm not actually going to use them because I just have to say it's so tedious when I come to this committee. And, I came up through my legislature. I'm used to working in a bipartisan manner. It's so tedious whenever we try to talk about issues like Social Security and Medicare that we get accused of being socialists. I hear that all the time in this committee by certain members on the other side. And I just have to highlight that across this country, I don't care what district you represent, the elderly in this country depend on Social Security and Medicare, and I don't think they think of themselves as socialists. They want a fighting chance to age with dignity, to not live out their lives in poverty. And so to come here and always have that hurled at us is not just insulting to us who are trying to work in a bipartisan manner, but it's insulting to Americans across this country who rely on those programs to live out a life of dignity. And we can have a conversation about bipartisanship and working together with dignity. And in fact, I will say the brightest part of my week this week was meeting in the Bipartisan Rural Health Caucus yesterday morning. Started my day that way. And we came together, Democrats and Republicans, and talked about issues that cut across party line, talking about the mental health crisis, the housing crisis, substance use disorder that is racking all of our congressional districts. And it was truly a conversation of how do we prioritize what the needs of our constituents are and how do we move forward. And so you can call me a socialist, you can call my constituents socialists because they want to have their Medicare and Medicaid protected. But what you're doing is showing that you're more interested in hurling names than actually getting down to the business of doing this work. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Vermont for her comments, and it's at least share the sentiments that we ought to spend more time working together to solve problems and debating the facts on both sides of the issue. With that, I would like to yield to my friend from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that this committee is taking the budget process seriously and I do want to especially thank our chairman, yes, the staff as well, but I want to thank the chairman in particular for pushing this process for this past 14 months or so, for being willing to put members on record, for even demonstrating the integrity and the courage himself personally to vote against bad spending bills. Not easy to do as a chairman, because our chairman understands how important this is, and that our spending, our deficit, our debt is simply unsustainable. Today demonstrates that this committee recognizes that this is more than just a campaign talking point. Our national debt has grown to $35 trillion, significantly larger than the size of our entire economy, something that has not been reached since World War II. We're well over $100,000 per citizen in debt, just an astronomical number. What do we have to show for each of us over $100,000 in debt? And our debt is growing by some $1 trillion every now 4 or 5 months or so. It'll grow to $36 trillion by the time we have our next election. And we're in the third year of the highest sustained levels of spending in the history of the country, which has, or what might be known as Bidenflation, Bidenomics, 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates, greatest deficit in the history of the country, not to mention the border crisis, 10 million illegals invading our country over the past 3 years, costing taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, 3 years into the war on American energy, interest payments on the debt exceeding now our national defense, nearly $1 trillion. And as has already been said, if no action is taken, Social Security and Medicare will be bankrupt, insolvent within a decade. So I wish that our friends across the aisle understood that, and that they had the, or whether they don't understand it or they don't have the integrity to help us address it, so that we can help those who we claim that we want to help, and they don't suffer the consequence of us not addressing it. And I wish all members of this body and the one across the Capitol on both sides of the aisle would join us in preserving and protecting the programs that the seniors in our country and those approaching senior status depend upon. So I thank the chairman, I thank the staff for the work to get us here today, and I look forward to supporting this step in the right direction. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good, and now yield to General Jack Bergman for 3 minutes. Also, our task force chairman on oversight, Mr. Bergman from Michigan, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first start by acknowledging all the critical work the committee majority has done up to this point in preparing this budget resolution. I think it goes without equal, at least in my short 8 years in Congress. From the outset of the 118th Congress, House Republicans pledged to restore fiscal sanity to Washington and to hold the Biden administration accountable for a spending addiction. It is what it is. The budget resolution before us today is a testament to our pledge. Not only does it establish a framework for reversing Biden's spending spree, which has totaled an unprecedented $11 trillion. It also reins in a runaway mandatory spending, the primary driver of our ballooning deficits and debt. While it's important to show what we will accomplish with this fiscal plan, we must also illustrate to the American people why it's so desperately needed. I come from a long leadership career in the Marine Corps, and I can tell you from experience that having a plan of attack is only half of the battle to begin with. And we've also talked about no plan survives first contact, but you have to stay engaged. We now have to engage our plan and push it forward. Laying the groundwork for why an attack is necessary is just as, if not more important. Without cause for attack, it's harder to gain public support for your plan. So it has to be articulated and it has to be continued to be pushed. Mr. Chairman, you and I and the rest of our majority on this committee know full well that the Biden administration has given us plenty of cause to move forward with our fiscal plan. And You know, just a couple of data points, which you're going to hear, I think, over and over from all of our members. Record high 34 trillion in national debt, 20% larger than our economy. And we heard earlier, if the American economy today is the epitome, of standard for the world economy, that doesn't say much for the world economy in total. So I would suggest to you, if we're going to be a standard, let's be a good one. And the point is, for the people watching at home, you need to know that for the everyday working American, whether you be single, whether you be family, whatever it is that you have people here who are trying to do the right thing and to use the analogy of the Capital One commercial, what's in your wallet. I think we're asking, based on this administration's spending spree, what's left in your wallet after the administration has been picking your pocket. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan, and now yield 3 minutes to my dear friend from Georgia and former Chief Deputy Whip, Drew Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this markup. And there's always a lot of talk and a lot of rhetoric around Washington, D.C. about people's ideas, how they're going to work. What we're doing today is we're actually taking action. We're showing House Republicans are willing to take a bold step to try to get our fiscal house in order. But I think we've got to be realistic about this. We didn't get this way overnight. It's going to take us a while to get out of it, but we are taking a bold first step, and that's really important. Think about the things that we're talking about doing here. Reining in wasteful spending, doing things to curb government spending that drives down inflation that is crushing every single American family, especially when they go to the grocery store or when they have to buy clothes for their school children. Think about the things that we're advocating for in here that actually help with the 4 major things that most Americans really want. When they go to work every single day, they want to be able to provide for their families. And they want to do it. They want a job that matters, and they want to be able to make ends meet. And runaway inflation has created a problem for families. And no longer can we continue to spend at the ridiculous rate that we've been spending. There's no more pandemic. It is time to get the fiscal house in order. Number 2, Americans want to live in a safe community. And this budget prioritizes things that are going to make America safer. Stronger defense, stronger border, making sure that American families don't have to live with the scourge of fentanyl. These are Republican priorities. Americans also want their children educated at a very high level. They really don't want them indoctrinated. They really don't want them to get degrees in things that really don't cause them to be productive in the workforce. And so this budget prioritizes changes in education that allow real changes so that our workforce can be aligned with where the economy is going. And finally, besides a house, and a good, safe place to live, and an education, American families want to be left alone so they can be who they want to be in this great country. And this budget prioritizes individual liberty and freedom. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for doing this. Look forward to the debate and the discussion. And with that, sir, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia and yield 3 minutes to our friend, Mr. Lloyd Smucker from the Keystone State. 3 minutes, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by pointing out that it's another new year, but President Biden has once again failed to send Congress his budget on time. And every day that we do not have a budget in time, just want to remind members and want to remind the American people, we're adding $10 billion to the national debt every single day that we've been forced to wait on his budget. And then I want to thank the chair. Certainly, we've made it clear, and the chair has made it clear, that this committee remains committed to fixing our broken budget process. We've made some progress, I think, as a conference on that this year. We're not there yet. We've at least attempted to move bills through the appropriations process as as called for in our budget process. But certainly going forward this year, we're going to work really, really hard to comply with the process as it's intended to work. And I think today's markup is the first step on that. So I want to thank the chair for doing that. By the way, when we pass this out of the budget, out of the committee today, we'll be 3 weeks ahead of schedule. And so again, the first step in moving bills through the process, this will give appropriators, once this is done, the numbers that they begin to need to work on an appropriations process. And, maybe this year, finally, we could do, if we continue moving down this path in the way that we are, we could do a 12-month budget before the beginning of the fiscal year. Not a novel idea, but it hasn't happened here in how many years, Mr. Chairman? Probably 30 years, maybe longer than that we've done this in the way that should be done. So I think it's really, really important that we do exactly that. We go back to regular order. We go back to an open and transparent process of passing our budget and letting the American people know how their dollars are being spent. And by the way, we should act with urgency on this. We've heard it here, but the national debt is close to $35 trillion. We also missed the projected deficit this year by $1 trillion. Think about that. If in the private sector, a huge miss like that, you'd call it a scam. In fact, no shareholder would invest in a company that has been off so far, so much in their projections. So we owe it to the American people to explain what is happening to their money, why for every dollar that we take in, we're spending $2 of taxpayer money, $2 of debt. And long term, the Fiscal Commission was mentioned. There are many examples throughout history of countries that have failed because of their fiscal policies. And so I just want to mention as well as, again, I think it's time for a national conversation about our long-term fiscal trajectory. And I think the Fiscal Commission that we moved out of the committee is a wonderful vehicle to begin to have that discussion. So again, it's going to be tough work, both the annual process, but also to address our long-term fiscal trajectory. This begins that process today. And again, I want to thank the chairman for his leadership on moving this bill today. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and now yield 3 minutes to my friend and colleague from the great state of Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, you are my friend. And what we say in this room does not impact on our personal interaction. Thank you for your service. We're going to miss you. I know that it's not soon, but thank you so very much. That leads me, however, to my great disappointment in the moving of the budget by the Republicans that just add to the enormous dysfunction and chaos that will be the plague of the American people if a budget that has been proposed by Republicans are allowed to pass. With trillions of dollars in cuts to programs that help the working and middle class, this Republican budget would rip the American dream away from hardworking families across the country. Donald Trump has promised more tax cuts for the rich, and this would double down on taking away. This is the take-away budget. This is a reckless budget. It's a painful budget to impact on millions of American lives by raising the cost of living and making disastrous cuts. Time and time again, my Republican colleagues have proven that they would rather push their unpopular and harmful policies. Unsurprisingly, they focus on cutting programs to help those most in need, including $2 trillion to mandatory health spending, which largely reflects drastic cuts to Medicaid. You can't get away from it. It's just like the previous Bush administration that indicated that they were not cutting Social Security, and they were. And we Democrats stood in the way to stop it. And we are a better country because we didn't privatize Social Security when that was the new kid on the block. Deep cuts to Medicaid would put more than 78 million vulnerable individuals at risk of losing health care services, including children. veterans, pregnant women, people with disabilities. Because of these threatening cuts, I will offer an amendment to this resolution which will increase funding for Function 550 by $2.2 trillion over the 10-year budget windows to reject deep cuts to Medicaid and other crucial health benefits. We'll also strike the policy statement on Medicaid work requirements in this particular bill and budget. In Texas alone, as of November 2023, there were 4,221,794 people enrolled in Medicaid, 984,000 plus of them in Harris County. And in my district, the 18th Congressional District of Texas, there were an estimated 24.8% of individuals enrolled in Medicaid in 2023. The gist of my remarks today, Mr. Chairman, is we can't go backwards. We have to go forward. This MAGA budget that the Republicans have offered for FY25 is taking us backwards, and as a member of the United States Congress on behalf of the American people, I will not accept this turn backward on the American people. I will not accept it. I yield.
I thank the gentlelady from Texas and now yield 3 minutes to our friend from the Hoosier State, Mr. Rudy Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to be here marking up the fiscal year 2025 budget resolution. As we have repeatedly discussed in this committee, our debt and deficits are undeniably out of control. Currently, our debt sits at over $34 trillion and continues to grow every day. Our ballooning debt, which was exacerbated by the Biden administration's spending spree on student loan bailouts, green subsidies, has led to inflation and blue state slush funds, making it harder for Hoosiers to feed their families, buy a home, or plan for their future. Our sky-high debt is not only a threat to the fiscal health of our nation, but to our national security as well. Currently, over $8 trillion of our debt is held by foreign entities, including China. We should all be concerned that China holds over $850 billion of our debt. As more and more taxpayer dollars get eaten up by interest payments, that's money that cannot be spent on military readiness and deterrence. This budget resolution makes meaningful changes to both mandatory and discretionary spending that are long overdue. For example, it caps discretionary spending growth, eliminates funding for tens of thousands of new IRS agents, and repeals $250 billion in green corporate subsidies. It reduces improper payments by 50%, achieving $1 trillion in savings over the next 10 years. It also works to strengthen and enforce work requirements for government programs like SNAP and TANF, strengthen Medicare, and advocate for a long-term Medicare solvency policy. Additionally, our resolution supports pro-growth policies like extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which grew our economy, increasing the production and export of American energy, and cutting down on the Biden administration's radical regulatory agenda that stifles growth and innovation. Overall, our budget resolution balances in 10 years, while reducing deficits by over $14 trillion and saving $2.7 trillion on interest payments. I remain committed to restoring fiscal responsibility to Washington, and this resolution is a critical step forward. Working to restore fiscal responsibility and get inflation under control isn't extreme, it's responsible, and it's common sense. I want to thank Chairman Arrington for his leadership and for bringing this budget resolution to the committee for markup today. I encourage my colleagues to support, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana and now yield to my good friend from the great state of Texas, Mr. Chip Roy, for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I applaud the chairman and the work of the committee for bringing forward legislation here, a budget that will balance in 10 years, which people say we can't do. I would note that all my colleagues have rattled through all the numbers that we face. $34.4 trillion of debt, $1 trillion every 100 days, $1 trillion in interest in 2026, more spending on interest in the defense this year. I mean, I just wonder at what point we're going to get serious on both sides of the aisle of addressing this issue, because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will hide behind taxes, and it's just frankly just not legitimate at all. And colleagues on this side of the aisle, frankly, will also hide behind not touching taxes and hide behind, well, mandatory spending, this thing over here, but we can't deal with discretionary. We'll deal with mandatory, but we don't ever have a plan. And this budget tries to break that and force us to the table. I applaud the chairman for putting taxes on the table. They should be on the table. Not because I think we're lacking revenue, and it's just the one thing that I really want my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to at least answer and say, okay, revenues to the Treasury were 19.6% 2 years ago. Federal revenues as a percentage of GDP. That's as high as it's ever been. Can we at least acknowledge that truth and go, okay, that truth exists? It's dropped off to about 17.5%, I think, in this last go round. That's the norm. That's the norm that it's been since before World War II. So can we just dispense with this notion of the tax breaks for the rich is leaving us all sort of hosed? It's just false. Flat out 100% false. Equally false is the notion that Republicans are going to adhere to this budget. They won't. They didn't yesterday. That's the simple truth. We passed caps a year ago, and we've already busted them. That's who we are as a body. That's what's become of this institution. We either want to pass a framework and do the tough work of dealing with tax policy, dealing with spending restraint, addressing the tough issues of mandatory spending, and not hide behind it with all the political rhetoric that people are going to die and people are going to starve, as if the country can't exist without certain programs in place in Washington. We're either going to honestly address these issues or we're not. But to then pass something in a budget that we don't adhere to is a fraud perpetrated on the American people. So let's do our work. Let's pass a budget. Let's adhere to it. Let's do better than it and do the work the American people sent us here to do. I yield back.
My friend from Texas speaks the truth. I want to thank Mr. Roy, and if any member would like to submit a written statement for the record, I'll hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have prepared written statements. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the budget aggregates, functional categories, and other appropriate matters. This text is identical to the tables distributed to the minority and posted online yesterday. Under Committee Rule 10, the committee will consider a document containing the budget aggregates, functional categories, and other components of the budget resolution. Amendments may be offered to this document subject to the agreement that me and the ranking member made. After this document has been approved, it will be incorporated in the text of the concurrent resolution on the budget for a final vote on whether to report the measure to the House. The committee will now begin the amendment process. The document, shall I yield? The committee will now begin the amendment process. The document will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point pursuant to the bipartisan agreement laid out earlier today. Debate on the amendments offered will be 10 minutes per amendment with time equally divided. Are there any amendments?
I have an amendment of this.
Clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. And in just a few seconds, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Amendment number 1 on Function 920 funding levels, offered by Ranking Member Boyle.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, my ranking member, is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As members can see, this amendment is entitled Defending the Independence of Ukraine. But actually, this amendment is just as much about the United States of America as it is Ukraine, and whether or not the United States will continue to lead the world that we created out of the ashes of World War II. We have been, for the last 3/4 of a century, the bulwark against first Soviet and now Russian expansionism. This country led the West under bipartisan administrations, Democrats like Truman and JFK, Republicans like Eisenhower and Reagan, every single presidency. We really had a bipartisan foreign policy, frankly, when it came to standing for the transatlantic alliance, standing for small d democratic values, and standing up to communist expansionism. What we see today is Vladimir Putin attempting to reconstitute the Soviet empire, frankly, as the new Russian empire. Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB agent and was actually in East Germany the day in November 1989 that the Berlin Wall fell, Putin once said, and I quote, "The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union." He has made crystal clear his ambitions as they relate to Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, the Donbass and the rest of Ukraine today. If he is allowed to succeed, this will not be the end of war in Europe. It will, frankly, be more the beginning than the end. Now, we have spent billions of dollars in defense of Ukraine over the last 2 years. Our European allies collectively have spent more than the United States. So we are not shouldering this burden alone. I thank our European allies, particularly Germany, but many others, the British, all of them have contributed. You have seen a dramatic ramp up in defense spending among our NATO allies. 18 of the 31 NATO countries are now at that 2% level. We need, by the way, to get to all 31 and now most recently 32 NATO allies. We cannot walk away from our responsibilities to Ukraine, but also all of our transatlantic allies. It will have devastating consequences if we do. And I'll leave you with this statistic. A recent U.S. intelligence report estimated that 315,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine. A recent British intelligence report puts that at 355,000. The little bit of spending that we have incurred in terms of our overall defense budget on Ukraine, over the last 2 years, we're talking about literally less than 5% of our own defense spending. This might be the greatest ROI, return on investment, that we have ever seen in terms of our defense spending. Ukraine is fighting the West's war for us. Let us make sure we continue in the great bipartisan tradition and continue to stand with our brave allies in Ukraine. The future of the world that we've built rests upon it. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and recognize, I guess I should ask if there are any members who'd like to claim time in opposition.
Mr. Chairman, I do.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ukraine. It's now been over 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. Congress has provided $114 billion in supplemental appropriations, not including potentially billions in additional repurposed, transferred, and reprogrammed funds. And yet we are no closer to getting a clear picture of the Biden administration's strategy for providing continuing U.S. assistance in Ukraine. This war is not going away anytime soon. Why are we funding long-term conflicts with emergency spending? Why are we proposing to have an emergency supplemental Ukraine spending in a 10-year budget resolution? This is not an honest, accountable, or transparent way to fund Ukraine. It's critical that Democrats and the Biden administration provide a real long-term plan with a real long-term budget proposal to fund this conflict. In fact, there have been more than one request of the administration, namely Representative Garcia and a few of us who asked the administration the same thing a few months ago. And I'd like to submit for the record a letter from the Budget Oversight Task Force to OMB requesting a full accounting on Ukraine funding. This letter was sent last October, and OMB has still not responded to the request. This lack of transparency and inefficient responses by the Biden administration and Office of Management and Budget on Ukraine funding is unacceptable. Unfortunately, this is not the first time the administration and OMB have received congressional correspondence requesting more details and information on Ukraine-related expenditures. For over a year, senators and members of Congress have sought greater transparency from the Biden administration regarding the total budgetary resources across all government departments and programs provided to respond to Russia's war in Ukraine. We got a lot of priorities. How about the border? Before we even discuss helping Ukraine getting their house in order, we must first get our own house in order. The crisis at the southern border is unequivocally one of the greatest threats facing our nation today. Since President Biden took office, there have been roughly 8.7 million encounters nationwide and over 7.2 million encounters at the southwestern border alone. The figures for known gotaways is over 1.7 million migrants and growing. CBP is overwhelmed on a daily basis and have zero support from the Biden administration and zero support from their own boss, Secretary Mayorkas. The American taxpayer is overwhelmed as well. According to the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the per annum cost of illegal immigrants on the taxpayer is $150.7 billion. Secretary Mayorkas confirmed that he is releasing in the U.S. 85% of migrants encountered at the southwest border. 85% of 7.2 million is 6.1 million, meaning 6.1 million illegal migrants entered at the southwest border and end up in the United States. Biden refuses to declare a state emergency, refuses to restart construction on the border wall and other much-needed physical barriers, refuses to reinstate Title 42 authorities, refuses to end catch and release, refuses to restart the Remain in Mexico policy, refuses to use any legal executive authorities to galvanize the CBP and bring some semblance to order. President Biden could stop the border crisis with a snap of his fingers, but he chooses to let this crisis continue. This lack of operational control is fundamental dereliction of duty perpetrated by the Biden administration. This is out of control. The governor of Texas has declared an invasion and appropriated over $13 billion in state funds alone to address the crisis of the border. Where's the federal government? Are we aware of our constitutional duty to provide for the common defense, protect the states of this union against invasion? We have 18,755 Chinese nationals cross the border so far this year. Our greatest adversary is actively using TikTok to show their citizens how to get into the United States through the southwest border. The numbers are staggering, and unfortunately, the administration's response is just less than positive, if non-existent. Once President Biden fixes our national security and humanitarian catastrophe at our border, then we can talk Ukraine. I urge a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan and yield the remaining 1 minute to my ranking member.
Republicans claim, as we just heard, that before we can help Ukraine, we must secure our own border. The reality is they're not mutually exclusive. We can and must do both. We're a great country with a budget in trillions of dollars, an economy in the tens of trillions. We can and must do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And the reality is, the reason why we don't have a border bill into law today is because House Republicans, and especially their own presidential nominee, would rather have the issue than solve the problem. We have a bill right now that passed the Senate, got 70 votes. Conservative Republicans and moderate Republicans joining moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats. A vote of more than 2-1 in the Senate. A bill, by the way, that I'm confident would pass the House of Representatives by an overwhelming margin. But Republicans won't allow a vote because they'd rather have the issue than solve the problem. I urge passage of this amendment, and I yield back.
I think, Mr. Boyle, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by my ranking member. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Request the report of vote.
Roll call vote is requested pursuant to the bipartisan consent agreement. We will postpone the roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Mr. Kildee.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. In a few seconds, I'll defer to Mr. Kildee for 4-minute opening remarks.
Amendment number 3 being considered second on Medicare, offered by Mr. Kildee.
I recognize Mr. Kildee from Michigan for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, this is my last year in Congress, which means my last opportunity to adopt a budget. And I do, while I disagree with many of the elements, I want to commend the chair for bringing this budget to the committee in a timely fashion. Let's discuss the contents now. When it comes to our annual budget, one of my priorities, and all the time I've been here, is protecting and strengthening Social Security and Medicare. Americans contribute to these important programs, Social Security and Medicare, throughout their lifetimes, and rightfully expect that these important programs are there for them when they retire. That's the deal. When you work hard, you play by the rules, you pay in, you ought to be able to retire with dignity and expect that those important programs will be waiting for you. And that's why it is disappointing that this proposed Republican budget resolution does not explicitly commit to protecting or strengthening Medicare. This is a program that millions of Americans rely on for their health care. Medicare is, including over 2 million people in my home state of Michigan. The way Democrats see it, Medicare is a commitment that we made to these men and women. It's a promise to honor their dignity and independence when it comes to their health care. This Republican budget resolution does, in fact, mention that they want to see bipartisan solutions to Medicare, and I agree with that. I think that's an admirable goal. But we already know that the track record of congressional Republicans, actually what it actually looks like. For years, some members of Republican members of Congress have offered to cut Medicare and to move toward privatizing it at the expense of those who rely on those programs. These proposals would be devastating to the people that I represent, and we can't allow that thought to move forward. So, my amendment's pretty simple. It affirms that Medicare is a critical program that helps seniors and people with disabilities cover their health care costs. It supports policies that would, 1, protect the traditional Medicare program, and 2, ensure that Medicare is funded for years to come, including by asking that wealthy individuals, everyone, including wealthy individuals, pay their fair share in taxes. These are common sense solutions supported by the American people to help protect Medicare for future generations. It's that simple. I think we can agree on that. We ought to state it in this budget resolution. So I hope my colleagues will join me in committing to protecting Medicare and the health care of millions of Americans. And with that, I reserve.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan. Does anybody claim time or want to claim time in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to claim time in opposition.
Mr. Yocum from Indiana, yield 5 minutes to claim opposition, debate the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit the Better Solutions for Healthcare letter of support for site-neutral payment reform into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
We can all agree that the Medicare program faces significant long-term fiscal challenges that are magnified by an aging population and rising healthcare costs. Over the next 75 years, the Medicare trustees project that Medicare will have more than $53 trillion in unfunded liabilities, or unfunded promised benefits. I and the Hoosiers I represent are deeply concerned about the long-term fiscal challenges facing the Medicare program. However, this amendment would not address Medicare's fiscal problems. This amendment is duplicative and unnecessary, as our budget resolution already includes a policy statement supporting the need for bipartisan solutions to save Medicare for those in or near retirement and to strengthen the program's solvency for future generations. Additionally, this amendment advocates for raising taxes on hardworking Americans, which will only serve to stunt economic growth. while not solving Medicare solvency issues. Our budget supports policies that follow recommendations from the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, as well as the Government Accountability Office, to address overpayments to healthcare providers in Medicare, freeing up resources to serve more American seniors. Our budget resolution also supports a fiscal commission tasked with making recommendations on policy solutions that address the fiscal challenges facing Medicare. We owe it to our seniors and future generations to find real solutions that preserve and protect the Medicare program for decades to come. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and with that, I yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Klein from Virginia.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana, and I rise in opposition to the amendment. The amendment would, as the gentleman said, make it more difficult to put in place the reforms that are necessary to balance the budget and save Medicare for future generations. The gentleman outlined the different policies that are supported by this budget that follow recommendations from the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, like equalizing payments for the same service through site-neutral payment reform, a policy that's been advanced in a bipartisan manner by the House this Congress. You know, if we are actually delivering better services for seniors across America and doing so at a reduced cost to the American taxpayers, is that a cut? It may be in the eyes of the gentleman, but in fact, we are allowing Americans to keep more of what they earn and yet get better services delivered to them through the Medicare program. My kids are only 12 years old. At the rate that Medicare is going, it will not be there for them when they are of age. It will be insolvent. The same with Social Security. We have to act to improve these services, improve these important programs for future generations. We can all agree that Medicare faces significant long-term fiscal challenges. Over the next 75 years, the trustees project more than $53 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So this bipartisan fiscal commission, which is in the budget, tasked with making recommendations on policy solutions to address the fiscal challenges with the Medicare and Social Security programs, is so important. Unfortunately, this amendment, instead of actually encouraging innovation and improvements to lower costs to the program, supports raising taxes on hardworking Americans to bail out the misguided policies of the Democrats. Raising taxes and stunting America's economic growth is not the solution to the looming insolvency or our $34 trillion national debt. We all know what happens when we raise taxes. It stunts growth. It limits the growth of the economy and the ability to keep up with rising costs. So we must approach these issues in a bipartisan manner. And our seniors are depending on it. The seniors in Indiana are depending on it. The seniors in the gentleman, Mr. Kilday's district, are depending on it, that we come together behind a budget that's going to provide common sense solutions that are going to save Medicare for future generations without raising taxes and hurting our economy. And with that, I oppose the amendment and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia and now yield the remaining 1 minute and the 10 minutes for closing comments from Mr. Kilday from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my friends for their comments. I'll just make a couple of notes. Number one, we recall a debate not too long ago here regarding the Fiscal Commission, and there was a commitment that everything was on the table, including taxes. But I find it interesting that when it comes to actually addressing the problems that we see in Medicare, and I suppose we could say the same thing about Social Security, it's revealed right here in this committee hearing that taxes are actually off the table, that there is no intent to make sure that the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share in order to make sure that these essential programs work, number one. Secondly, I disagree. Not only did I write the amendment, but I also read it. It does not make it more difficult to deal with reforms. It simply says, as we go into the question of how we're going to make sure that Medicare is solvent, that we just commit to the American people that we're going to do it in a way that does not cut the essential benefits that are required to keep them healthy. That's the promise that we make when we ask them to pay into the Social Security and to the Medicare payroll tax to the funds that support these programs. That doesn't mean we can't reform. It just says, and when we do that, we're not going to take away essential benefits that keep them healthy. We ought to be able to at least say that. The amendment's not more complicated than that. It's simple. Let's promise to the American people that as we wrestle with these tough questions, we're going to come up with solutions. Everything should be on the table. Reforms can be on the table. Taxes should be on the table. But what should not be on the table is a threat to cut benefits that seniors depend upon. That's what the amendment would do, and that's why I ask my colleagues to support me in this. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman
Mr.
from
Chairman.
Michigan. The question is on,
Mr. Chairman,
I'm sorry.
can I ask
Fine.
unanimous consent to submit two things for the record? Medicare Payment Advisory Commission MedPAC report to Congress from June 2023, and President Obama's FY 2017 budget that proposed to reduce Medicare coverage of bad debt.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
The question now is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Kildee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, ask for a recorded vote.
Roll call vote is requested. Pursuant to the bipartisan consent agreement, we will postpone the roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Ms. Omar.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. In just a few seconds, I will then defer to Ms. Omar for her opening statement.
Amendment number 7, being considered third on Function 600 funding levels, offered by Ms. Omar.
I yield 4 minutes for opening remarks by Ms. Omar, and then we'll have 5 minutes from the Republican side, and then yield 1 minute for your closing. 4 minutes for Ms. Omar.
My amendment would fund vital nutrition and housing programs that many vulnerable families depend on, especially children and seniors. This amendment fights against the dangerous cuts that our Republican colleagues continue to push. Especially, it funds the national school breakfast and lunch programs to make sure that no child goes hungry. It fully funds WIC, helping nearly 7 million women and children afford nutritious foods. WIC funding is also provides healthcare referrals for low-income pregnant, postpartum, and breastfeeding women. This is especially crucial at a time when Republicans are rolling back healthcare protections for women. My amendment also provides robust funding for rental assistance and housing development, like the supportive housing for the elderly program. And LAHEAP would see a major funding boost as well, ensuring that millions of families can afford to heat their homes during the coldest and warmest months. Finally, my amendment would strike the policy statement attacking the Biden administration's reevaluation of the SNAP Thrifty Food Plan. TFP sets the standards for prices of food and the amount SNAP recipients receive from the program. It has not been updated for 45 years, and so this administration took the sensible step to improve TFP through an evidence-based process. But even with the modest increases in benefits after this evaluation, SNAP still only provides about $2 for each meal per person. I cannot understand how my Republican colleagues could argue that such meager aid is providing too much support to low-income households. But since my colleagues across the aisle like to claim sometimes that they can only work within a balanced budget window, I crafted my amendment in a way that is cost neutral, so no excuses this time. All the funding I've just detailed would be offset by finally requiring the wealthy and corporations to pitch in just a little bit like everyone else. These revenue raisers could include increasing the corporate tax rate, imposing a minimum tax on billionaires, or closing the carried interest loophole. My amendment protects and enhances our social safety net, unapologetically prioritizing the interest of working families over the rich. If you care more about improving your constituents' well-being instead of lining the pockets of corporate elites, then the answer should be clear. Vote for this amendment. I yield back.
I thank Ms. Omar, and now ask the question if any member would like to seek time to oppose.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Klein is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take the full 5 minutes. I just want to note that this budget already provides about $6.5 trillion to income security programs over the next decade, and as has been pointed out many times in this committee, the best social program is a good and stable job that puts the American dream within reach of every American, no matter who they are or where they come from. The dignity of work is what we're talking about and what is being promoted in this budget. So none other than in 1996, then Senator Joe Biden justified his own vote for bipartisan welfare reform, which included work requirements to incentivize employment and reduce welfare caseloads. He said, and I'd love to hear him say this tonight, the culture of welfare must be replaced with the culture of work. The culture of dependence must be replaced with the culture of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility. So I oppose this amendment. I hope we hear something about personal responsibility and the importance of and dignity of work tonight in the State of the Union. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I certainly appreciate the intention of Ms. Omar in offering the amendment. And I think I've spoken on this issue before. We have 100 means-tested welfare, roughly, programs in the federal budget and in the people's government here in Washington, and it's costing $1 trillion. I think the American people, at least every American I've met along this journey for 8 years, has a big heart for their fellow Americans in times of need or in situations where they can't make ends meet because they're working 2 jobs, especially in this inflationary environment, and they're still struggling. And then there are some people that are not capable because of disability and other circumstances. Most Americans want to help, and there are certainly a number of safety nets to do that. What we don't want is for the safety net to become a hammock and a lifestyle. I read a study from Heritage Foundation that the government provides more than $65,000 in welfare benefits per year for poor families. Look, helping people, giving a hand up to our fellow Americans in need is, I think, part of the American ethos. But for good intentions or not, we've trapped millions of people in poverty and dependence on welfare, which is why we need common sense work requirements for work-capable adults in this country. There is no such work requirement, for example, in Medicaid. Medicaid is the largest of the means-tested welfare programs. It's costing about $500 billion, but there's no reasonable and sensible requirement for able-bodied people to work or to be looking for work. I don't think anybody, if you took this out of the political context, would say that that's not something that makes sense. We also put program integrity measures. I mentioned earlier that we have over $2 trillion in improper payments, waste and fraudulent spending. Medicaid last year had $50 billion. EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, another cash welfare program, was losing 33 cents on the dollar. Listen, whether you're for that program and you believe it's serving its intended beneficiary or not, the beneficiary is losing 33 cents. We're not getting the money to the people who need it. And it's poor stewardship as fiduciaries of tax dollars to not have, for example, asset and income verification. We ought to do that regularly. Are you eligible for this program, or have you moved to a position where you're ineligible? We need states to have skin in the game. We need incentives, both carrots and sticks, for agencies and states to make sure we don't improperly pay folks. And then back to my colleague from Virginia's comment about jobs. We have spent $14 trillion roughly on anti-poverty programs since we declared war as a country on poverty in the 60s. The poverty rate hasn't moved much. We've spent trillions of dollars, and still today, the best anti-poverty program is a job. And I believe the pro-growth policies in this budget will incentivize and encourage and foster growth and job creation so people can have a better opportunity for a bigger paycheck. And that's, I think, the best way we can help our fellow Americans. With that, I yield to the gentlelady. I know I went over my time a little bit, so I'll be generous with you, Ms. Omar, for your closing comments.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you for your decency in your response. Having a job is important, and that's why this Democratic administration and President Biden has prioritized in creating jobs. 15 million jobs have already been created. We're talking about helping people who are in desperate need. WIC does not go to people who can afford to feed their children. You know, school programs are not for people who can afford their children. These are programs that are essential to the most vulnerable citizens of our country. When we talk about the deficit, when we talk about cuts, we're not hearing anybody say it is a problem that Republicans pushed $1.7 trillion in tax cuts to help corporations and billionaires. What I am asking for, what the Democrats are asking for, is for us to be sensible and for us to be decent when we think about those that are the most vulnerable who are in need in our country, and cutting these vital programs that are so desperately accessed by them is not a sensible thing to do. It is not a neighborly thing to do. It is not a religious thing to do. And I just hope that we recognize as a country that we must do all that we can to help provide the straps so that people can pull themselves up. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize, I did it again.
No,
I'm asking unanimous consent to submit material into the record. An article from the Heritage Foundation entitled "Welfare Increase in U.S. History Will Boost Government Support to $76,400 per poor family." An article from the American Enterprise Institute titled "Do Work Requirements and Safety Net Programs Work?" and CBO's February 2024 baseline projections for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program into the record.
Well, that's the longest title I've ever heard, but without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, we're moving on to the question. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Omar. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Ms. Omar requests a roll call vote. Pursuant to the bipartisan consent agreement with my ranking member, we'll postpone the roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Barbara Lee.
Thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. And in a few seconds, I'll defer to Ms. Lee for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and
Amendment.
ranking member. Oh, excuse me.
1 minute.
Amendment number 4 on Function 800 funding levels offered by Ms. Lee.
Just a few more seconds, Ms. Lee, so everybody's got a copy in front of them. The gentlelady from California has 4 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member. My amendment would block the Republicans' proposed cut of $85 billion to the IRS and general government agencies and ensure that our government has the resources to prioritize economic justice, reduce fraud, and combat wealthy tax cheats. The cuts to general government agencies under the extreme GOP budget proposal hampered critical efforts by the IRS to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. My Republican colleagues claim to be committed to combating unethical payments in federal spending, but cutting these funds does just the opposite. By preserving IRS funding, we can better address the exorbitant wealth gap in America and create a tax system where everyone pays their fair share. Extreme wealth gaps are not just a source of economic injustice, but a major threat to democracy. The richest 400 people in the United States have 22,000 times the political power of the average worker. That's simply not right. My amendment would also help to reduce the deficit. On February 29th, the Congressional Budget Office released a report highlighting how rescinding $35 billion from the IRS will reduce revenues by $89 billion and increase the deficit by $24 billion over the next decade. By rejecting these cuts, we can actually reduce the deficit that Republicans mention so frequently and increase revenue, allowing us to reinvest in communities that need it the most. It's unacceptable to allow these reckless GOP budget cuts to increase the deficit and enable wealthy tax cheats to exploit our system. So I encourage my colleagues to reject these funding cuts by supporting this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady from California. Does anybody seek to claim time in opposition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Roy from the great state of Texas, I yield 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. I do seek time in opposition with all due respect to the gentlelady from California, with whom I'm happy to work on, for example, ending 20-year-old authorizations of the use of military force, and that we need to re-engage on that. happy to work with you on that. And look, on this issue, my father worked for the Internal Revenue Service for about 24 years, I think, which, you know, kind of odd for a, you know, conservative from Texas, but my dad moved here. He actually worked right down here, 1111 Constitution Avenue, and the work of the IRS is important to carry out the function it is charged to carry out. The expansion of the IRS under the so-called Inflation Reduction Act will have a disproportionate impact on people that do not have significant means. That's just the data from the IRS's own data. The number of audits that will be directed by their estimates, the IRS, on people who make significantly less, say under 100,000. You've got hundreds of thousands of Americans that would be dealing with audits of the plussed up power given to the Internal Revenue Service. There's nothing in the IRA that limits those targets, by the way. It has some findings language that talks about it being focused on above $400,000, but there's no statutory requirement on that. But even so, I mean, the fact of the matter is, roughly, and these are ballpark numbers, they change by the year, you know, the top 1% of the population is paying about 40% of the taxes. So I'm not sure what the fair share here is. If anybody over there can tell me on the Laffer curve or any other curve you want to put out economically about what tax rates yield the most revenue, if that is your goal in the first place, I don't think anybody in this room knows. I don't think anybody in this room knows what rates yield the maximum revenue. So then we've got the IRS here, and I'm going to yield to my friend from Utah here in just a minute. This bill is just simply empowering the IRS to go after large number of American citizens. And you know that, I think, is not something that is in the best interest of the people. The IRS audits the poor at 5 times the rate of everyone else. That's that bastion of conservatism, CBS News. New York Times, black taxpayers at least 3 times as likely to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service. The basic point is, so-called tax cheats can afford accountants and lawyers to manage a highly complex tax code, which is my last point. If we want to solve this problem, simplify the code, make it to where it is much more difficult to navigate that with tax lawyers and accountants, and let's get busy doing the work we need to do to get our fiscal house in order, and I would yield to the gentleman from Utah.
I thank the gentleman and my good friend from Texas. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit an analysis of the Economic Policy Innovation Center regarding the IRS revenue collections into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Much shorter title. I want to make three quick points to continue on with the data that my colleague, Mr. Roy, has shared. One, to the 7 Americans outside the Beltway watching our committee hearing right now. That's not a joke at the ratings we're going to get, but sincerely, if I wish the American people could know kind of one of the plays that you do when you create legislation back here, and both sides do it. We have to deal with CBO scores, and so in the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed on party line votes, Democrats needed something to be able to lessen the score of that massively expensive bill, and so they included this IRS funding, and with the plan that if we include a bunch of IRS funding, we're going to be able to grow the revenue. Unsurprisingly, it isn't working. According to the data from the IRS, the agency collected $160 million in revenues in FY23 attributable to the IRA. They originally expected to collect $2.9 billion. That's 5.5% of what the expectation was. Through Q1 of 2024, the IRS collected $360 million. This is just 5% off its goal, its expectation to collect $7.8 billion of revenues in FY24. Attributed to that. Folks, the whole IRS funding piece from the IRA was just to create a pay-for, so the CBO would lower what the cost of the IRA was, which is actually now twice as expensive as it was expected to be. Like, let's just be honest with each other. I represent some of the hardest working IRS employees. I wish your dad would have been in Ogden. He would have loved to have been in Ogden near Snow Basin and all the other amenities of that great state. We should be focusing on making sure they have what they need, the tools they need to do their job. They have some of the worst customer service capabilities. They have some of the worst technology. They're trying to ramp that up in Ways and Means. We just hosted and had the commissioner on, and we talked extensively about the work that they're trying to do. That's the area we focus. Give them the tools to do their job, and then we'll talk about workforce and what's needed to just plus that up. But don't do it for some CBO gimmick. Like that, the American people need to be able to see through that, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Utah, and now recognize again the gentlelady from California for a 1-minute closing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would actually do just the opposite of what specifically my good friend Mr. Roy mentioned. It would reject the harmful Republican cuts to the IRS and general government agencies and ensure that hardworking taxpayers are protected from extreme GOP policies. This funding supports the IRS efforts to ensure that wealthy taxpayers are paying their fair share and combats waste, fraud, and abuse in the tax system. Investing in an effective and efficient IRS is a common sense solution to reduce the deficit, increase revenue, and bolster resources for our most vulnerable communities. So I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, yield back the balance of my time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady from California, and the question now is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Lee. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote, please.
Roll call vote's been requested by Ms. Lee. Pursuant to the bipartisan consent agreement, we'll postpone that roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Ms. Ballant, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady has an amendment, and I'd ask the clerk to, what do I ask the clerk to do? Let me find my notes here, sorry. The clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of the amendment. In just about 30 seconds, I'll come back to you for opening remarks.
Amendment number 9, being considered fifth on climate change, offered by Ms. Ballant.
Ms. Ballant, I now yield 4 minutes for your opening remarks. Give you the 1 minute of the last word.
Thank you. We in Congress have a critical role to play in combating climate change and in investing in clean energy. And climate change is real, and it's caused by human actions. And it's imperative that we act and act strongly to address the crisis. We're seeing storms and extreme weather we haven't seen before in this country because of climate change. And last summer, Vermonters weathered extreme flooding that left many communities devastated, and we're still actually rebuilding from that catastrophe. And this winter, Vermont has seen record low snowfall amounts, and maple sugar makers are starting the tapping season the earliest ever. So we see in Vermont, up close, how climate change threatens the crop yields, the infrastructure, water and energy supplies, human health, and creates looming disaster assistance needs. It also threatens our economy. There's no question. In 2021 and 2022, the United States had 35 separate billion-dollar extreme weather and climate-related disaster events costing more than $180 billion in direct economic losses. Congressional Democrats and President Biden have tackled this issue head-on. Last Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act made the greatest federal investment in history to fight climate change. It invested nearly $400 billion in climate solutions and clean technologies to deliver the single greatest investment in combating the climate crisis in American history. It also lowers costs for American families, creating jobs here at home, advancing climate justice, and positioning the United States as the global leader in clean energy. What we're dealing with today are Republican policies that consistently put polluters over people and jeopardize our family and our planet's futures. Republicans' H.R. 1, their number one priority this Congress, is a massive giveaway to corporate polluters. It guts our bedrock environmental laws and jeopardizes clean air and safe drinking water. I'm here today calling on my colleagues not to roll back the investments that we've made to improve our future. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady and ask if there are any members who would like to claim time in opposition.
Mr. Chairman, I would.
Mr. Burkeen from Oklahoma, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment on a budget-related measure trying to turn us back to solvency within 10 years, a budget that is looking at sanity, fiscal sanity. I appreciate Chairman Arrington putting forth what Congress has lacked to put forth so many times. But yet we have this amendment that would strike Section 415, and instead of focus on deregulation, it seeks to expand federal efforts to fight climate change within our budget resolution and build upon the IRA. Overregulation has consistently hurt small businesses. It has strangled the growth capacity in our nation. It is the catalytic converter that's choking out the opportunity for our roaring engine, our economy, to produce what it needs to have the kind of enhancement to our GDP, in addition to cutting spending. According to the American Action Forum, since President Biden took office, his administration has published 792 final rules at a cost of $451 billion, $500 billion just by him bringing about more regulation. We are a country of regulation without representation, where unelected bureaucrats continue sitting in cubicles and enforcing their ideology upon the American people. $450 billion, this president alone, $500 billion in regulatory enhancements that's borne by the average family. And we have 400 agencies and sub-agencies staffed by these unelected bureaucrats who put forth these new regulations on the backs of our nation. This problem continues to get worse under President Biden. He spent $1.5 trillion through various decisions of using his executive action. Think of the student loan bailout. Think of the what he's done on enhancing food stamps. All absent Article 1, Section 1 that says all legislative powers be vested in the Congress. It's absent the rule of law. The burden of his expansion of government regulatory regimes is borne by small businesses, innovators, and yes, American families. This amendment seeks to replace deregulation section of our budget policy to encourage more spending on Green New Deal policies. The Inflation Reduction Act
included billions of taxpayer dollars dedicated to these progressive climate provisions that President Biden and the Democrats put in place several years ago. This amendment seeks to enhance upon that. Already, we have $27 billion going to the EPA that was enhanced just 2 and 3 years ago. $3 billion for climate block grants. $3.4 billion to convert federal buildings of the GSA into climate-friendly status. $2 billion to incentivize construction materials that are more climate-friendly. $3 billion for air pollution at U.S. ports. $1.5 billion for tree planting. Anybody know we have a $34 trillion gross national debt? $1 billion to force clean, heavy-duty vehicles, forced upon the American people who can barely afford the vehicles on the road now. $3 billion for U.S. Postal Service, which is billions of dollars in debt for new electric vehicles at the displacement of affordable fossil fuel-powered engines. In the days and weeks following a flood or a wildfire, you'll constantly hear people talk about, they blame that on climate change. Even in this amendment, it references in line 2 that there are rising sea levels and warming oceans, and it says that the United Nations Climate Change Panel says that these human activities are provoking all of this. Well, I would encourage my colleagues to take a look at something I commend Representative Gary Palmer from Alabama has put together in the policy booklet. Go through and actually look at what the UN panel on climate change actually says. To quote them and not be able to go to look at the specificity of what they actually say, they talk about flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, and drought wildfire combos. You know what they say? They said that there's no causation and effect in the United States for those things on climate change. Yet every media outlet and every talking point up here that wants to advance the Church of Nature ideology always contends the opposite of what the UN themselves in their own panel actually says. It's pretty astounding. So, look, it goes without saying, many of us are opposed to this. I encourage a no vote on this amendment. We are already fundamentally struggling with regulations. The Mercatus Center study says if we just go back to the 1980 level of regulations, there would be a $4 trillion bump to our gross domestic product. And yet this amendment seeks to add more regulations. Mr. Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to enter the record an article titled Tax Foundation Scott Hodge Monetizing Clean Energy Tax Credits Create a Sham for Bad Policy. And then Cato Institute's document comparing the cost of IRA energy tax credits to expensing. And with that, I'd yield, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Ballant, you have at least 1 minute. I'll give you some change there, too, to make your closing comments.
Appreciate that. Mr. Chair, I agree with my colleague that we do need fiscal sanity. Absolutely. And it's utter insanity not to deal with the climate emergency. You also spoke, my colleague also spoke about small businesses. Our capital city in Vermont, Montpelier, lost nearly every single small business in our downtown because of catastrophic flooding as a result of climate change. Every single business. We're still coming back for it. We don't have a functioning post office in our downtown. For Vermonters and rural communities across the country, climate change is here and it's having a catastrophic effect. It's not just a threat to our small businesses, but also our agricultural industry, our natural resources, our very livelihoods. It's a threat to our survival, our community's survival. We need budgets that create and sustain good-paying green jobs, enable our farmers to withstand climate change, protect people living in our low-lying areas from flooding, and transition us to a clean energy economy. This is not just about the here and now, it's about the future, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to the budget resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady from Vermont. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Ballant. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Ms. Ballant asked for a recorded vote pursuant to our unanimous consent, our being me and the ranking member. We'll postpone the roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, before we move on to the next amendment, if I could just very briefly, this was more relevant to the previous amendment we discussed on IRS resources, and it looks like the gentleman from Utah has left. I was going to just respond to his comments about IRS revenue and not being as high as projected. It is true that it is a little bit off. Actually, it turns out we understated the amount of additional revenue that would be collected from increased IRS resources. So to that end, I'm submitting to the record this statement from the Department of Treasury, just released last month on February 6th. It's entitled U.S. Department of the Treasury, IRS, released new analysis showing the high return on investment from Inflation Reduction Act resources.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman,
I have a,
Yeah, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
for 1 second, I'd like to ask the ranking member on this. There's been a lot of effort and a lot of talk about going after, I think the amendment was really focused on the high-income earners.
Yeah.
I firmly believe that every American should be in compliance with the tax law. Okay, whether you're a billionaire, whether you're a millionaire, whether you're like folks here in Congress and you're a 10,000aire and below. My point is that if you're gonna focus these resources, we should drive it all the way down and make sure that folks throughout the entire economic spectrum are in compliance with the tax code. I also think, and I think it is important to look at the people that are preparing the taxes and the tax preparers to make sure that they are in compliance as well. I just offer this as a comment that no matter where you are in the income spectrum, compliance in the tax code is important. With that, sir, I yield back.
Yeah, first I'm disappointed the gentleman from Georgia didn't call me a bird dog this time. I was kind of, it's not too late though if you want to do that. Second thing I would say is, seriously though, and I appreciate the chairman letting us engage like this. I actually think it's more interesting to folks and maybe sometimes more productive as well. I have to say, I don't disagree with one word that he just said. The rest of us who pay what we owe properly, we all end up having to shoulder more of a burden anytime any person cheats, whether it's a billionaire or someone making $10,000 a year. The only thing I will say is that when they asked Willie Sutton why rob banks, he replied, because that's where the money is. It turns out we're getting more revenue by focusing on those who have been cheating at the very top because that's where the money is.
And, okay,
Last
I won't dispute that fact, but we should be getting revenue, we should be fair about how we do this.
Completely agree.
And when you look at tax preparers that are cheating the system with earned income tax credits, child tax credits, there's a lot of fraud from the tax preparer's standpoint there. It creates other issues with improper payments. So again, I'm not disagreeing with, where some of that money, let me say this. We just need to be fair throughout the entire tax code because I think it's beneficial to the American economy when we're fair up and down the tax code.
I think I can certainly say I'm in agreement that we should equitably and fairly apply the tax laws and enforce those tax laws. Everybody has to pay what they owe. And if we need to change that, we need to change the laws. With that.
So I'd ask then to,
Yes,
without
without
objection.
objection, so ordered. Now, Ms. Schakowsky, I know you've been patiently waiting. You have an amendment at the desk. Let me get the clerk to go ahead and read that out.
Amendment number 2, being considered sixth on Social Security, offered by Ms. Schakowsky.
Ms. Schakowsky, while they're passing this out, if you'll give me just a few seconds. And I yield 4 minutes to the gentlelady from Illinois for 4 minutes, and then we'll debate, and you'll get a 1 minute closer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think it'll surprise anybody that I wanted to discuss an amendment that has to do with Social Security. There are 70 million Americans that are on Social Security right now, and many of them depend on Social Security for most of their income. That's about 70% of those 7 million recipients rely on Social Security for most of their income, and I know that in every single congressional district, people are happy to get that Social Security check. I think it's really important to understand how much people pay into Social Security. This is not a gift to people. This is an earned benefit. With every single paycheck, workers pay into Social Security. And at the end of the day, they expect to get it back. In 2023, the average American paid a maximum of, paid into Social Security. But many people do get away with not paying very much. The maximum that I'm missing this. Where is that? 22,000. The maximum. Sorry, 168,000. 168,000 is the maximum that is paid. That people pay into Social Security. And after that, people who make more money don't have to pay any additional into Social Security. And so, and the average benefit that people get is very little, about $23,000 a year is the Social Security benefit. And if you're a woman, it's about $2,000 less than that. So we all are happy for the constituents that we have that get Social Security. But let me tell you what my amendment is. My amendment, and I'm hoping that you can all vote for this, my amendment states that it is the policy of the budget resolution to make sure that we strengthen and secure Social Security by making sure that the benefits are there, and that we extend the Social Security solvency for many years to come. Now, I do put in there that potentially including making the very wealthy pay an additional money into Social Security. But I want you to note that that is now a requirement in this, but I hope that we can all understand that the amount of money where we stop collecting into the Social Security fund is, for many communities, actually just an average income, not wealthy Americans. We haven't changed that for a long time. So we think it is time to raise the amount of money that the wealthiest Americans pay into, but for sure, all of us ought to agree that those benefits have to continue and that the solvency of Social Security should go on for many, many years. And with that, I will yield.
I thank the gentlelady for being so punctual. You should have been here at the beginning to set the standard for everybody else, because it's gotten away from me. But I'm going to yield now to the chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee on Ways and Means for rebuttal. The gentleman from Georgia, yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am just thrilled to know, and I say this with sincerity, that my colleague offering this amendment is as passionate about securing benefits for retirees as Republicans are. And I think that one of the things that we need to recognize is that this is a big issue, and it will be solved in a bipartisan manner. And this budget resolution sets up a bipartisan debt commission, and that will be one of the functions of that, is to address that in a bipartisan way. If we do nothing, we will wind up paying beneficiaries significantly less by year 2033. So doing nothing is not an option. But I will also tell you that simply raising revenue by those people making $400,000 or more is not going to solve the problem either. It is not even going to solve a quarter of the problem, okay? No. Here's the other problem that I have with the amendment. and talking about people making $400,000 or more and corporations paying more. Here's the problem. Social Security is a payroll tax. Corporations don't pay a payroll tax, right? They don't have it. So this is based off of payroll. So number one, it's got to be on payroll. The other thing too is I think that we've got to be, I think when we go into this discussion, we have to have political courage to have the discussion, and we've got to be intellectually honest with one another. And this issue cannot be used as a political dividing point, not one day longer. This is something that Republicans and Democrats are going to have to be bold, strong, courageous, smart, tactical, and we're going to have to do this in a very thoughtful way going forward. We may need to look at other ways of solving this beyond simply increasing thresholds like Ms. Schakowsky has recommended here. I would say before we raise one dime of revenue or increase taxes on our fellow Americans by so much as 1 penny, we should get the waste, fraud, and abuse out of the system. And our Social Security Subcommittee, there is bipartisan support for doing just that. We have been having multiple hearings, and quite candidly, the improper payments piece of this is significant. So we should be investing more in the technology side of this within the administration. We should be investing more, or actually what we should be doing is making sure that the Social Security Administration is deploying the resources that have already been allocated in a very smart way and an efficient way to be able to get the best bang for the buck when it comes to our IT. We should be seeing how they're using AI to speed up the process. We should be be demanding that they use AI to help against fraud claims and to help fraudulent the criminals that are defrauding the system. There's a lot of stuff that we should be doing right now to deal with the improper payments and the misallocation of funds with the current revenue streams. And then we got to be thoughtful about how we go into it. Look, we've got the amendment that we had just prior to this, dealing with climate change. I think a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are going to be shocked one day when they wake up and realize that this massive environmental movement has been funded by Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Communist Party over a long period of time. If we are look, defending the Ukraine is important to a lot of people in this body. We've had an amendment on it so far. But why in the world would we not be smart about what we're doing? And if we're going to fund the Ukraine, let's cut off Putin's war machine. Let's cut off his funding stream. Why don't we open up LNG exports to Europe in a massive way? Why don't we undercut Putin's revenue stream? Why don't we undercut Iran's? But we're making false choices here. Fund the Ukraine, but go after crazy environmental policy that's undermining American competitiveness around the world. Why don't we increase the export of our American clean energy and technology, use it to help win this battle in the Ukraine, and simultaneously, why don't we use the excess revenue to pay down our debt or to help solve a major issue like Social Security funding? Instead of using this as a political tool, let's use our brains and figure out smart ways of doing this. Mr. Chairman, if I could, I know I've kind of gone on a little bit here, but there's some information I'd like to have submitted to the record.
Yes, sir.
And this is the Board of Trustees report for dated 3/21/23. If I could have that submitted to the record, and sir, I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman's time has expired, and reserve now the last minute for a closer from the gentlelady from Illinois.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ferguson. But the reason I think everyone on this committee ought to vote for this legislation is it does not require any other additional source of funding for Social Security. What it does is say that all of us on both sides of the aisle agree that the funding has to continue, that Social Security is a good program, and that we should make it solvent over time to make sure that it's available, ongoing. And so this seems to me that it ought to be something in our budget resolution that we are discussing today to show our unanimous agreement that Social Security is important, that the benefits have to continue, and that there ought to be security and solvency for Social Security going forward. That's really the only imperative thing in this resolution. And while I have strong feelings about asking those who now are anything over something like $157,000 don't have to pay anything more into Social Security, is kind of ridiculous in a country where average, where $500,000 isn't an unusual income anymore. So I would like us to just say yes to Social Security, yes to the solvency of the program, and then we will certainly have many other discussions about how we make that happen. So I hope you notice that this does not require any particular addition of funding.
I think the gentlelady from Illinois, as a point of privilege, I'd like to say, in the Reverse the Curse budget resolution, we make note that we share your sentiment, that we want to strengthen and save these important safety nets, programs for our seniors, the earned benefits that they paid into it. The problem is, in the next 10 years, as you know, they both will be insolvent, and if we do nothing, there'll be a 24% cut, I think, across the board for our fellow Americans who happen to be seniors and beneficiaries. We believe that getting this discussion in the context of a bipartisan commission is the most productive way to come out with a consensus solution that will put our seniors and the American people first, like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did. And I think that's the vision that makes the most sense, but I share your sentiment, and I appreciate the amendment.
Yes.
And but the question, your question is on the table now, and the question is on agreeing to Ms. Schakowsky's amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A roll call vote may be
I
requested.
would like to request a roll call vote.
Ms. Schakowsky, pursuant to my consent agreement with the ranking member, we're going to postpone that roll call vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk.
Mr. Trone. The clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute the copies of the amendment, and then I'm going to yield to Mr. Trone for 4 minutes of opening remarks.
Amendment number 8, being considered 7th on prescription drug costs, offered by Mr. Trone.
I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For far too long, Americans have paid more for their prescription drugs than citizens in any other major economy in the world. For far too long, prescription drug prices have driven up prices in pursuit of record corporate profits, forcing many Americans to choose between health care or feeding their families. But now, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats passed into law last December, which I hate to mention, no Republicans voted for in the House or the Senate, the affordability of marketplace health care has increased. The cost of insulin is capped at $35 a month for Medicare enrollees. And for the first time in history, Medicare can directly negotiate the price of covered prescription drugs to combat Big Pharma's price gouging, saving money for patients and taxpayers. Huge win, a huge win for Americans. In my home state of Maryland, the $35 monthly insulin cap has lowered the cost of out-of-pocket for over 21,000 Marylanders. Monthly marketplace premiums have been reduced by hundreds of thousands of dollars for roughly 153,000 Marylanders. Free vaccines have benefited 55,000 Marylanders. And Medicare Part D reforms will save residents nearly $111 million in 2025. These savings are changing lives for the better in our communities all over the country. And so for these reasons, we must protect the vital provisions under the Inflation Reduction Act and reject efforts to weaken this transformative law. That's why I urge my colleague to support my lower prescription drug cost amendment. This amendment strikes the language that threatens Medicare drug price negotiations and inserts a new policy statement on lowering prescription drug prices for American families. It's imperative we empower Medicare to negotiate drug prices so our seniors can get a better deal. Our seniors are depending on us to do the right thing, to lower drug costs and put an end to price gouging. I welcome your support. I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland, and unless any of your Democrat colleagues want to comment, I'm going to open it up for any member that would like to claim time in opposition.
Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
Mr. Blake Moore from Utah, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Some of the other members. Chairman, I think you and I know each other for a few years. Feels like many. You know that I have a problem with candor and sometimes being a little too much so. What we're doing here, this exercise right now, and particularly with the last amendment, but probably all of them, to force a vote so then we can do political attack ads. And you know what? Our party's, guilty of it too. If we truly want to deal with the last one was named Protect Social Security Benefits and Solvency, let's come together. When we offered a bipartisan debt commission, and it was and there was a handful of really close, good friends of mine on the Democratic side willing to support that. I think we'll get a bunch more when we get it to the House floor. I encourage others, and to my colleague and my friend from Maryland, we've talked about a lot of those same issues. I think there's more there that we can do in a productive way than put out the amendments, force the vote, and then all of a sudden, you see some attack ads going to the more vulnerable districts. Again, sorry for being too candid on how we operate here, but we can do better. We can do better than this. Drug costs are a hugely important thing too. And so I'm going to speak to this amendment a little bit and share some. And I also, another game that's played back in Washington is when the majority creates a bill, then the minority will usually come up with a counter name to it. They're usually pretty funny. There is one that I did end up liking a lot. I don't overly use them, but when the Inflation Reduction came out, we came up with the same sort of name-calling bill in response of Innovation Reduction Act. And while those are gimmicky, I will admit, I do want to hit the point of when we go after these big government price controls, we are limiting the ability for the industry to create more cures. There's one particular really strong piece of information that I wanted to share. I'm just going to read it. The CBO has acknowledged that innovative new drugs hold the power to significantly reduce health spending, particularly by addressing chronic diseases, which are a huge cost to the U.S. healthcare system. I have toured multiple different Bio Utah and BioHive. There are these two organizations in my home state that are heavily focused on creating the innovation needed to be able to tackle our biggest health issues. Drugs that are related to, some of the most costly issues, from obesity to diabetes to heart failure. These are the things that are driving up our costs significantly. A good friend, on the Ways and Means Committee with me, Mr. Schweikert from Arizona, he says it better than anybody. Everything we're doing in healthcare-related policy right now is having just another group finance it. And that's what I view the Innovation Reduction Act to have done, was, okay, so we're gonna cap this, and then we're gonna force another group to pay. Nobody is actually solving true healthcare costs. And what I believe this amendment will do, what we're trying to do in the healthcare world is add transparency, add competition, things that drive every other market that we exist in, that we, in bipartisan agreement, agree is necessary for the private market to exist. But for some reason, healthcare is like, we can't provide patient choice. We can't provide that transparency. So a patient, an outpatient, not even talking when you're in an emergency, can choose, oh, that x-ray is X dollars, this x-ray is Y dollars. I should be able to choose this provider over this thing. We just want to create that and actually lower healthcare costs. What we're doing here arbitrarily limits our ability to go after cures and to go after true healthcare expenditures. You've seen the, what point? An analysis from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office concluded that the IRA will lead to fewer medicines reaching patients. Independent analysis from leading economists, including from the University of Chicago, has forecasted the IRA will lead to over 100 fewer cures and therapies reaching patients. And as my time expires here, I want to make sure that I request unanimous consent. The point is, we need to go after cures. American innovation leads the charge here. And we need to maintain that is what we have here in the U.S. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from CBO to Senator Whitehouse acknowledging innovation prescription drugs that have reduced federal health care spending into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Time has expired, and we will yield now a minute to our friend from Maryland for closing comments. It will take a magic minute if you want and be a little generous.
Oh, that'd be great, Mr. Chairman. I just would respond to my colleague that thank God he's not running my business. Thank God. Because he likes the idea of having not be able to negotiate for anything he buys. Everything he buys, he's happy to have the price from the supplier, big pharma, just give him the price and accept it and say, that's all good. How good is that? Well, that's not good. Big pharma makes more as a percentage of sales than even the software companies do. Big pharma is gouging Americans. Talk to a big pharma corporate executive. Talk to a CEO. I have, and they'll tell you 3 times more than what we pay because countries like France say, give us a better price or we're not going to carry your damn drug. We'll carry another drug that does the same damn thing. But we're here supporting, you are supporting big pharma. You're taking their money, you're taking their pay, you're taking their donations, you're taking their PAC money, and it's no wonder you don't want to do anything to upset big pharma. That's all you are, a tool of big pharma, and it's ridiculous, and we're tired of it. So get with the program and support the American consumers. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland, and now the question is on agreeing to his amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Yes, sir. The roll call vote is requested, but pursuant to the consent agreement, we'll just postpone that roll call vote until the end of the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas. Clerk, will you designate the amendment while the staff distributes copies?
Amendment number 6, being considered 8th on Medicaid, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
Now yield 4 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas.
I thank the chairman. And I was hoping to hear a resounding voice from the other side saying I claim the time in support, because I don't and cannot imagine anyone that has seen the positive impact of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, from FDR with Social Security to Lyndon Baines Johnson with Medicare and Medicaid, would in any way reject the Jackson Lee Amendment, which is to restore the support and to eliminate the deep cuts to Medicaid, to increase budget authority and outlays for Function 550 by the following amounts in billions of dollars to reject the deep cuts of Medicaid. And of course, I'll just hold up for pictorial sake the work that we've done, and we've done serious work. And we strike Section 409 of the Chairman's Mark, and we make the changes that are necessary. But the resolution maintains Medicaid funding on the current law level. The resolution rejects any policy to convert federal funding of Medicaid to a block grant or per capita cap, or impose restrictive conditions on Medicaid eligibility and benefits. All that does is slash the very heart out of a lifeline that so many families need. There are families of disabled children. There are families of disabled adults. There are families who have no other source of health care than Medicaid, and that will be taken away from them. I ask any of you to walk through your districts, get away from the high-price locations, and walk in the lower ebb grocery stores, or some of your public schools, or some of the neighborhoods that don't look as attractive. The streets are not as clean, and you'll find people in desperate conditions. They may be living in a food desert. They're certainly living in a healthcare desert. About a year or two ago, I gave $2 million to a historically black college. It was to deal with the healthcare desert in their parameters. People had no doctors to go to. They had no clinics to go to. And if they were going, it was Medicaid or fee-for-service. And this resolution accommodates the level of Medicaid funding by acquiring ways of doing it. We have a way of doing it, which deals with wealthy corporations who are willing to say that the economy is popping, the economy is percolating, they're hiring more people. And so there's no desperation in our corporate community, but there is desperation for people who need health care. And the Republicans focus their cuts on these programs where people are in need. We put more than 78 million vulnerable individuals at risk of losing health care services. I was here for the Affordable Care Act. I supported the public option or the expanded Medicaid. I live in a state where it was not taken. And friends, we are not better for it. We are worse. And I am seeing desperate people in my district who need children. Their children need access to health care. They need to have access to eye doctors, hearing doctors. They need, many of our children are needing mental health care right now. And we work so hard for mental health parity. Any form of access. So children, veterans, pregnant women, people with disabilities, and seniors. Because of these threatening cuts, I am offering this amendment to increase funding for Function 550 by $2.2 trillion over the 10-year budget window, to reject deep cuts to Medicaid and other critical health benefits. It would also strike the policy statement on Medicaid work requirements. In Texas alone, as of November 2023, there were 4,221,794 people enrolled in Medicaid, 485,000 of them in Harris County, one of the largest counties in the nation. And in my district alone, the 18th Congressional District, that's why I fought to get back here, there were an estimated 24.8% of individuals enrolled in Medicaid in 2023. 2021, Medicaid covered 42% of all births in the United States and paid for 44% of all long-term care, including nursing home care. That's another place my colleagues across the aisle should go. Walk to the skilled nursing homes. See some of the conditions our seniors live in, but they wouldn't have any space if it wasn't for the Medicare payments that are made. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Medicaid was a lifeline for those who lost their health coverage and were unable to find work. During that pandemic, people were hospitalized, and more often than not, they died. We lost over 1 million people to the pandemic before we found the vaccine. Many of them were in the hospital with Medicaid benefits. Now that the continuous enrollment coverage requirement has ended, states are resuming their redetermination of unwinding process. We must protect Medicaid benefits. As of March 4, 2024, more than 17.7 million Medicaid enrollees have been disenrolled in the United States, including 2 million in Texas. They work to disenroll them. They work to allegedly save money. I can't tolerate the devastation that this does to families, to the toddler, to the infant, to the elderly, and then the work requirements that are built in on false and unproven assumptions and are a backdoor way to kick people off Medicaid. I can assure you that we do ill to this nation, do ill to our economy, If we continue the path of the Republicans to gut Medicaid, the program actually helps low-wage workers to get care that enables them to remain healthy enough to work. Mr. Chairman, please join in supporting the Jackson Lee Amendment. It is the humane and right thing to do for America. I yield. I reserve my time.
I think the gentlelady, her time has expired. We will give you 1 minute, though, to close. And I'm going to open it up for any member, though, now who would like to claim time in opposition for 5 minutes. Are there any members who'd like to? Mr. Ferguson from Georgia, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I'm going to speak in opposition to this amendment on several points. Number one, I was a Medicaid provider for a number of years in my dental practice. And there's a significant difference between having access to a program and utilization of that program. And I can look at what we've done. Let's ask 3 questions. Are we healthier now than we were prior to the ACA? The answer is no. Every stat shows that Americans are less healthy today. Do we have better utilization of the system today than we did prior to the ACA? The answer to that is no. And the third question that I think we ought to ask is, are we paying more or are we paying less for our health care insurance today than we were prior to the ACA? And the answer to that is no. So utilization is below where it should be. Americans are less healthy, and we're spending an exorbitant amount of money on this issue. And so to say that we just need to do more of the same is going to push Medicaid to grow in an unsustainable way. We aren't doing anything to go after the improper payments and the waste, fraud, and abuse that is happening in this particular space. So let's be real about this. Since the implementation of the ACA that my colleague from Texas just bragged about, Americans are less healthy, utilization is down, and costs are through the roof. And on that cost piece, I would be remiss if I did not take just a second and respond to the gentleman from Maryland's tirade that he threw in the last amendment. That sounded more like a Senate speech than a serious member of Congress trying to solve an actual problem. And for him to go after another member here, I just thought was beneath what the hard work that you and the ranking member have done to build real conversation here. That was unfortunate, and I feel sorry for him for doing that. Because look, at the end of the day, when you look at healthcare costs and look at pharmaceutical costs, there's a lot more to blame to go around than just pointing the finger at the folks that are inventing cures. Think about the administrative costs, both in the Medicaid program and in the ACA and private health insurance. Think of the growth of the administrative cost. We are paying providers less across the board, and we're paying administrators more. There is nothing worse than being in a healthcare practice where you have to constantly add staff to push paperwork instead of actually caring for patients. And the vertical integration of the healthcare delivery system that's both incentivized and caused by the ACA is driving administrative cost and middleman cost through the roof. You know, if you want to make a real impact on drug cost here in America, maybe we change the capital structure on how research and development occurs. Maybe we fix the supply chain issues so we can do it here in America. Maybe we go after the really incestuous problems that exist with the PBMs and their relationship with the insurance companies and the other entities in the vertical integration of the supply chain, where they force these really ridiculous pricing rules and formularies together to actually limit access to many medications. Maybe we go after that. But I just would say this. The gentleman from Maryland, I wish that he would come. He took a great big rock and threw it over here, and then he walked away. That's if you're going to go after a colleague over here with basically what amounted to a political tantrum I just think, Shane, I think you ought to come back in here and debate this issue some more, and I'm happy to do it with him all day, every day, and twice on Sunday. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I think the gentleman with the remaining time here, I'd like to weigh in a little bit. I know Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee has the best of intentions. We need to help the working poor. Healthcare expenses is out of control, one of the big debt drivers. The per capita cap is like the Medicare Advantage, which has allowed the beneficiaries to have more services. The improper payment rate is real, $50 billion last year, and that needs to be addressed. We need skin in the game from states. The expansion of Medicaid by the ACA to healthy adults, the match rate on that is 90%. We don't do that for the pregnant, for the blind, for the disabled, and the extremely poor. That's an inequity. We ought to have work requirements for work-capable people, and we ought to incentivize personal responsibility. My point is, let's fix this program. It's not just about more resources. There's a way to redirect resources and save and reinvest when you have a program that works for the taxpayer and the beneficiary. With that, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, a minute for your closing remarks and some change if you need it.
I would be very grateful to some change because I want my good friend from New York to express the pain in his district when Medicaid has been cut, and then I will follow up. He'll take a few seconds, Mr. Espinat, and you'll yield back to me.
Thank you.
Saving Medicaid.
Thank you. I speak in support of this amendment. Medicaid is crucial to the 13th Congressional District of New York. I may add that it proved life-saving during the pandemic, and these cuts amount to death. It's as simple as that. Medicaid cuts equals death in districts like the one that I represent. With that, I yield the remaining part of my time to the distinguished lady from Houston, Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me appreciate the
Extending the gentlelady's time.
and I was getting ready to thank the gentleman and the chairman. Mr. Chairman, none of us are afraid of oversight, correction, or improving the implementation of a lifeline, as my colleague from New York said. But I've really got to say to you, if you walk our neighborhoods, and that's neighborhoods across America, if you walk rural America, Medicaid is crucial. And the light way that we say there should be work requirements, yes, you can point to, in quote, some slight improvements, but you can also quote to the eons of people that have been thrown off, never to be seen again. They may die. They don't have the benefits. They have a pregnancy only with the graciousness of our public health system in our local communities. Texas doesn't even have the expanded Medicaid. My hospitals come to me every year begging for the 1115 waiver. They spend money and they don't have any money to reimburse or to provide more care. This is wrongheaded. We need to put the $2.2 trillion that I've offered in this amendment. We need to save Medicaid, we need to save lives, and we need to come from birth to one's demise. But don't kill them because they don't have health care through Medicaid, and that you require some catastrophic work requirements that are only going to make them sicker, make their families poorer, and literally cost their life. Support the Jackson Lee Amendment. Medicaid is a vital lifeline for America.
And I thank the gentlelady from Texas. The question on agreeing to her amendment is on the table. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. All those, no. No. Okay, well, the opinion of the chairs is that the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very concerned about your hearing. You're still such a young man. But I believe, well, I'll yield to Ms. Jackson Lee.
I will admit that wasn't the loudest and proudest no. You must have been very convincing and compelling, and I'm not surprised because you're a Texan. But the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Would you like a recorded vote?
I would. I thought we had it, but I'd like a recorded vote.
Well, we will find out later because we just agreed on a consent basis that we're going to roll these to the end of the hearing. So thank you, Ms. Lee.
Thank you.
Are there any other amendments at the desk?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean,
Let me, if you would, please, sorry, Mr. Espaillat, the clerk will read this out. I'm sorry, I'll come back to you. We'll distribute the amendment. Just gives about 10 seconds, and then I'll yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from New York.
Amendment number 11, being considered ninth on childcare, offered by Mr. Espaillat.
Now yielding 4 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm introducing an amendment that would add a deficit-neutral reserve fund that would increase access to childcare through funding essential programs like Child Care Development Block Grant and reinstating the Child Care Stabilization Grant Program. In 2023, the average American family spent more than $700 per month on child care costs. This is a 35% spike from the average level in 2019. In my home state of New York alone, annual infant care cost is more than $15,000. And the wage of workers, who tend to be women and people of color, has historically been close to the minimum wage. As prices continue to climb, parents may make the tough decision to quit their jobs to look after their children. This is particularly important for women. This responsibility disproportionately falls on mothers, potentially undoing decades of progress of improving women's labor force participation. You've seen more and more women at the workforce, and yet access to childcare can do away with all of that. Investing in childcare means investing in our economy. It means investing in America. We must fund programs that meet the needs of our families. This should also include support for home-based providers who can provide linguistically and culturally relevant care to children of families who work untraditional work hours. Housing, Mr. Chair, and childcare continue to be a major expense for the American household. It is breaking their backs financially and driving people out of states to other places, moving out of homes to other places where there is maybe more affordable, but it continues to be a major challenge of America, the cost of housing and the cost of childcare. And so, Mr. Chairman, this amendment will help address these critical needs. There are childcare deserts throughout the country. I'm sure that in your state, Mr. Chairman, there are many places that are childcare deserts where the childcare services are just not available for working moms and working families. This amendment will address that. I'll yield back the remaining part of my time.
I thank the gentleman from New York, and now ask if there are any members who'd like to claim time in opposition.
Chairman.
Mr. Blakemore from Utah, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And before I forget and do it at the last minute, something I often do, I ask unanimous consent to submit a report from the American Enterprise Institute into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And the name of this title was More Choice, Fewer Costs: 4 Key Principles to Guide Child Care Policy. It's an excellent piece. It highlights several issues from choice costs, comparative of what folks are making in this industry, hours worked. I loved a point in here that actually said that this industry, even though it's tough, because parenting's tough, and I'm glad to speak on this, and I'm going to bring some of my own children into the mix here. Even though it's tough to do childcare, it's something that a lot of people still want to do, and I think that's a really positive indicator for our nation that it is. It's a really excellent summary of this. And I want to also thank the gentleman from New York for bringing this to dialogue. Sincerely, we have to be willing to address this issue, because strong families is, as I mentioned earlier, part of the hope that we all need to have. Having strong families is fundamental to us being able to thrive in our economy. Republicans care deeply about making child care more affordable. Personally, I have 4 boys, 11, 8, 8, and 2. So we're kind of in the mix of it right now. We've got a 2-year-old that's going to start some preschool next year. We've got kids in the public school system. I have a little boy who's on the autism spectrum. And we have to, didn't see that one coming, Chairman. We have to send him to a different school next year. He's not getting the support that he needs. And I keep talking to my wife about, how can we do this and everything. And he's going to be able, there's a really amazing option, all of which is handled by our public school system. And the Salt Lake City school system, our teachers, our principals have been unbelievable at making things available to him. My point is, in my little time here in the federal government, but my willingness to dig in and understand why we have so many issues and fiscal related, we create a lot of programs. And we try to do a lot because we love kids and we love making sure people have health care and we love to do all this kind of stuff. And we will never do it better than a state. That is why in the 10th Amendment of our Bill of Rights was that the federal government can't be doing too much. We need to empower that back to the states. And this is something that I'm very passionate about because I see Utah go through this and do this extremely well. We've got pilot programs going on throughout the various elements of the state, adding in pre-K to a public school system. And in my opinion, there's trouble, there's difficulties with that. There's workforce issues, there's space issues, there's a lot of problems, but they're doing programs to try to address this. And in my opinion, that is a very, very good way to help tackle this. But in addition to all the different talking points that you can do on this, we need to be able to foster choice and competition and allow for these certain free markets to apply. But the fundamental issue for me is, and I see us do it so much, we try, we care, we want to establish a whole bunch of government programs, then they get lumped into mandatory spending, and then they get left there, and we never vote on them again. We never have the ability to reform them. We never have the ability, in even a bipartisan way, to go and address this until it gets so dire that we have to propose a bipartisan Fiscal Commission to try to deal with some of these major programs that we do. So my point on this is we all care about children, and we know that childcare costs are very difficult. We're experiencing it ourselves. But we have to be able to enable the states and our local communities to deal with this better. And if we try to do too much, I know this will get lumped into mandatory spending, and then it becomes a massively growing pot of money that we will continue to run deficits for. And I make those points sincerely about my own experience and seeing the amazing work that is done in my local school and our school district and from our state. And I want to encourage us to embrace that as much as possible, and I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman in 9 seconds. We can't pay for the mandatory programs we have today because of the debt to borrow to pay for them. Every child under 18 owes $500,000. I know your intentions are good. I think there are better ways to do it at the local level and ways to incentivize businesses and to offer some of these benefits. But I think it's an issue, and I think we need to do it. We just got to do it the right way. But you get the last word, Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleagues' comments. 4 boys, I feel your pain. But even though we may have differences on how to approach this locally versus the federal government, I think the federal government could be a force of good. You can't have really 2 standards. America must move together, united. You can't have opportunities in one state and denial in another. So childcare is truly a necessity. And as you see, Mr. Chairman, it's a bipartisan necessity. It's a bipartisan crisis. It's not just in blue states, it's in red states. It's not just in my district, it's in my colleague's district. And it's a necessity, and too many families do not have access to quality care. The cost of child care continues to rise while the average income and the average rise of cost of living continues to impact their access to it. So, Mr. Chairman, I would again ask for your support for this amendment, and I yield back.
I think the good intentions and the spirited discussion and the compassion behind it from the gentleman from New York and the gentleman from Utah. Let's put this on the table now for consideration. Question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Espiat. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman has requested a recorded vote pursuant to our consent agreement. We will postpone the roll call vote, but we'll have one. It'll be at the end of the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Mr. Doggett, from the great state of Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You don't want to amend another Texan's budget resolution, do you?
I want to achieve the objectives that you recognized yesterday in a very eloquent comments in the Ways and Means Committee. When you said that our nation's debt is a serious problem and that tax cuts don't pay for themselves.
Well, the gentleman yield for 1 minute, just 1 minute. Let's go ahead and get the clerk to read this out, and then I'm going to give you 4 minutes and then a minute to close.
Amendment number 5, being considered 10th on the tax reserve fund offered by Mr. Doggett.
Okay, I'm going to yield 4 minutes to my friend from Texas, and then we'll have a 5-minute rebuttal. He'll close with a minute. Mr. Doggett.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I was saying, I thought you spoke well yesterday in the Ways and Means Committee. We might differ about how much of the problem we have now is the result of Democratic spending and how much of it is the result of Republican tax breaks. But however you deal with it, we will not solve the problems that we have in our fiscal house by spending changes alone. There have to be revenues that are added, and your comments indicating, as certainly not out of line with every Republican witness I've ever questioned over many years in the Ways and Means Committee has said the same thing, that these tax cuts don't pay for themselves. It works well at political conventions to say the contrary, and the myth is promoted, but I offer this amendment in the spirit of fiscal conservatism and the spirit of honest budgeting. This amendment ensures that we accurately and forthrightly consider the fiscal impacts of any change in the tax code. As you have it currently written in Section 302 of your resolution, you basically just kind of wink at the tax cuts. And so we can put in place here a resolution that appears to have balance, but if you ignore the giant deficit gaps that are created by unpaid for, unlimited tax breaks, then you do not have a true budget resolution. These are the kind of changes that explode the deficit and would not be counted as cost of the budgetary total. This proposed resolution, as written with this section, really permits the fiction that a budget with massive revenue cuts would somehow improve our fiscal situation instead of dig just a deeper hole as has happened in the past. I think that with this section in the bill, which I would adjust to make it deficit neutral, that you really have the kind of gimmicks that the Congress budgeting process, when it has occurred, have made really pretty worthless. And figuratively, worth less is the value of a budget that ignores this, really worth less than the value of the paper the resolution is printed on. This amendment just makes one simple but crucial change. Further tax cuts must be paid for. You can pay for them with revenue, you can pay for them with spending changes, but you can't leave them just out there hanging and ignore them. For instance, a number of my Republican colleagues are sponsors of legislation to extend the expiring Trump Republican tax cuts of 2017. The estimates that have been done of that show that it will deliver tax cuts, over $25,000 per year on average for the richest 1% of Americans, and for the poorest 20%, about an average of a $100 reduction. And all of that will come, according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, at a tremendous cost, about $3 trillion. $3 trillion more to our deficits if there is not a way of offsetting it with revenues or spending. Without my amendment, we're headed to another budget-busting reality, just as happened in the past. I, of course, served on the Ways and Means Committee when Alan Greenspan responded to my questions and indicated the problem under President Clinton was we were paying down the budget too fast. We had a balanced budget at that time, but multiple rounds of tax cuts have created much of the problem that we have today. We need to consider that, and I would just urge, Mr. Chairman, adoption of this amendment to be consistent with your comments yesterday and to make this budget resolution consistent with what you say the objective is, to really get our fiscal house in order, which I agree with you we need. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas and ask if there are any members who'd like to claim time in opposition.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to claim time in opposition.
Mr. Yakum from Indiana, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit an article from the Cato Institute entitled "Research Shows Taxes Matter for Investment and Growth" into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
This amendment would modify the reserve fund for pro-growth tax policies by requiring it to be deficit neutral. We have intentionally written into our budget resolution to allow for authorizing committees to prevent tax hikes and support pro-growth policies. I oppose this amendment because it places a leash on the Ways and Means Committee and restricts its ability to respond to the economic realities we face now and in the future, as it contemplates simplifying or improving our tax code. This amendment would introduce a requirement for deficit neutrality. However, who would determine if the tax cuts are deficit neutral? I have serious concerns about the CBO and the JCT's ability to capture an accurate cost of tax reforms, given that they underestimated tax revenues under the TCJA by $1 trillion. We do not have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. A spending problem that has been greatly expanded by President Biden's fiscally irresponsible policies, like his endless student loan bailouts, IRS expansion, and massive government-issued subsidies for green technology. Our budget resolution supports pro-growth policies like extending the TCJA, which will spur innovation, create jobs, and foster greater economic growth. Tax policies like the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act that was passed out of the House last month are essential to supporting middle-class families and small businesses and achieving strong economic growth. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and with that, I yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. Members, this proposed amendment to the budget, which aims to restrain the Ways and Means Committee's flexibility in responding to economic challenges, is short-sighted and potentially detrimental to our nation's fiscal health. Our budget emphasizes the importance of preventing tax increases and fostering pro-growth reforms. This amendment fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of economic conditions. Placing a leash on the Ways and Means Committee limits its capacity to address the pressing economic issues, and it stifles the potential for effective tax code improvements. This proposed amendment fails to acknowledge the significant discrepancy in revenue projections and actual outcomes, casting doubt on its reliability. Ultimately, tackling the deficit requires a comprehensive approach that considers both revenue and spending, rather than imposing constraints on a vital committee's ability to navigate economic challenges. I urge a no vote, and Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit a congressional testimony. The costs and complexity of the federal tax code demand reform into the record.
Without objection, so ordered. With the remainder of the time, let me say this. We have to grow this economy. We cannot grow out of this level of indebtedness, but we have to have the incentives for the risk takers and investors and the industry captains and the mom and pop entrepreneurs to invest and grow their businesses and take the risk, create better jobs, and that if we can do that for at a level of 1% over the 2% that CBO projects over this budget window, that would be $3 trillion we can put towards the deficit, or what I like to call the deferred tax on our children. You're right to bring up my comment. I think we ought to pay for anything and everything that either side talks about being good for the American people. If it's growing the government, the IRA, the IRA just on the green energy corporate tax subsidies, that was a part of the IRA. It was projected by CBO to cost about $250 billion. Now they've reconfigured that or projected $800 billion. It could be over $1 trillion. So that didn't pay for itself. We know that the tax cuts brought in record revenue to the tune of $1 trillion. Did it pay for itself? What I say is, I don't know if it does or doesn't. We need to offset whatever it is that we present as good for this country. The most recent tax break, that it was a bipartisan tax proposal, actually repealed a tax credit to pay for the tax cuts, essentially. So we just need to be responsible. Having our children pay for stuff is, I think, immoral as much as it is cowardly. So whatever we propose, let's offset it. So in the spirit of what you're saying, I would agree. We ought to offset things. But we got to grow this economy. More taxes are going to just be further drag, especially when we're teetering on a recession. With that, you got a magic minute there,
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would invite, given your comments, your support of this amendment then. I'm for your giving any incentives for growth you want to give that you can justify as actually encouraging growth rather than just a throwaway giveaway to multinational corporations to keep dodging their taxes, even though they're already so low that the top corporations are paying about half the tax rate that a working mother trying to support her family at the average wage in this country pays. That's wrong. And those kind of incentives may sound good coming from some of the corporate lobby, but they don't work. But if you have incentives, good or bad, all this amendment says is just offset them, be budget neutral. And it's surprising to me to hear my colleagues say that they question deficit neutrality. You don't question deficit neutrality on spending. You don't question CBO on spending. If they can evaluate the spending request, then the very objective, very independent Joint Committee on Taxation can estimate the effect of tax changes. And we know the effect that those tax changes have had. The estimate is $3 trillion. How can you claim that you have a budget that is going to be in balance if you ignore that potential? We believe that you need to consider both. We will not get to a balanced budget without doing that, and I urge adoption of the amendment.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. The question is on agreeing to the amendment from Mr. Doggett. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And
We request a
roll call vote will be rolled and postponed till later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Mr. Scott, let's go ahead and read this.
Mr. Chairman, I remember this number 10.
And the clerk will read that out. I'll then ask Mr. Scott to make opening remarks.
Amendment number 10, being considered 11th on education, offered by Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott, I yield 4 minutes for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, programs to support higher education create opportunities for students to attain more schooling, which ultimately allows them to improve their lives and increase their lifetime earnings potential and creates a more productive workforce for employers. We must not gut these programs, which are a lifeline to students and families. The federal student loan programs support millions of students in affording higher education. Income-driven repayment plans in particular have made it possible for students to affordably pay back their debt after they finish schooling. And so we have to reject any efforts to cut these programs, which will allow students to afford their loans and make other investments in their future, like buying homes. Pell Grant program in particular is critical in helping low and moderate income students access higher education. Maximum Pell Grant in 23-24 school year. The maximum grant was $7,395. As the cost of college rises, low-income and minority first-generation students face even greater challenges in accessing a college education. And higher Pell Grants actually reduce the need for students to take out loans. Pell Grants are the largest source of grants for secondary education and is an important part, along with loans and institutional aid, in helping students afford higher education. Program supported over 6.1 million undergraduate students in 2021, helping put higher education within reach. American economy needs more students completing college, but families are struggling to cover the cost. College education expands opportunity, boosts workforce productivity, and studies have shown that a college degree dramatically increases employment and wages. This amendment is deficit neutral, fully offset by requiring wealthy corporations to pay their fair share. Thus, the wealthy to pay their fair share, for example, by raising the corporate tax rate, imposing minimum tax on billionaires so that they pay at least 25% of their full income, and closing the carried interest loophole. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my...
I thank the gentleman.
The balance of my time, subject to the rebuttal.
Okay. I thank the gentleman, and now offer or ask if there are any members who would like to claim time in opposition. Mr. Grothman, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to submit for the record an article in the Wall Street Journal, Biden's student loan boast. And secondly, also submit a document here called the Penn-Wharton Budget Model, estimates the President Biden's new income-driven repayment plan could cost taxpayers over $550.
With that objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. Now, as far as this amendment is concerned, well, first of all, I recently on the Education Committee got to hear Claudine Gray, the president of Harvard University, and after hearing her, it's hard to imagine anybody feeling we need any more money thrown into college education in this country. But what I would like to point out is I think rather than throwing more money at the university system, it would be better to try to reduce the number of loans in the first place. It's worth taking a step back and pointing out, well, the Democrats have been working to unfairly forgive student loans. Republicans have been working to address the root cause of this problem, the high cost of higher education. To address this issue, I've introduced a bill, the Informed Student Borrowing Act, a bill that will help educate students on the risk of borrowing through the student loan decision-making process to better serve the student's financial future. And I'll tell you, I talked to a loan counselor in a major college in my district. I was shocked the lack of compassion she had for the amount of student loans that some of these students were graduating with. Indeed, she was using the ability to take out more and more loans as a selling point to go to her university. Currently, the passive decision-making process for taking student loans has many borrowers make poor financial decisions. I would encourage from here on out that we address the student loan problem either by having less students go to college, and there's no question we have way too many students going to a four-year college. We'd be better off if more going to tech school and skills-based education. And secondly, making sure that while they are going to college, that they receive good financial information so that they don't take so much out in the first place. But I yield the remainder of my time to the wonderful Bob Good.
Well, I've never heard that before, but thank you, Mr. Grothman. I am also in strong opposition to this amendment because it's not necessary and it would increase spending and further add to our national debt. As a former Pell recipient myself, I'm certainly sympathetic to the program and I appreciate the good that it can do. This budget resolution, however, does not make any cuts or changes to the Pell Grant program. In fact, it provides flexibility for the Committee on Education and Workforce, on which I serve, to expand eligibility for the Pell program. President Biden's student loan transfer scheme harms American taxpayers and future generations of college students. In just 3 years, Biden has attempted approximately $1 trillion of so-called loan forgiveness, violating the Constitution to make law unilaterally and spend money without congressional approval. President Biden's initial unconstitutional student loan transfer scheme would have cost taxpayers well over $300 billion. And his 6 unwarranted extensions since then, his pandemic student loan repayment pause, have increased the deficit by $165 billion. President Biden's latest form of backdoor student loan transfers, the so-called SAVE plan, could cost taxpayers as much as $558 billion over the next decade. More than 60% of Americans, however, do not have a college degree. Thanks to Biden's policies, the 87% of adults without student loans will be forced to pay for the 13% who do. When the federal government transfers the bill for student loans to those who didn't borrow them, it's effectively telling colleges to raise prices and demand students borrow even more. Why wouldn't they do that, of course, if that were to go through? In fact, since 2000, over the last 24 years, college tuition and fees have increased 186%. This amendment seeks to implement socialist progressive tax schemes on top of that, including raising the corporate tax rate that would hurt our economy and discourage job growth. According to a Heritage Foundation analysis from 2021, raising the corporate tax rate 7 percentage points will reduce long-term GDP by about $1,650 per American household. Our nation has a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and this amendment doesn't recognize that and is out of touch with where the American people are today. Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment. I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, and now yield the remainder of the time for closing, or for a minute for closing, to Mr. Scott, also from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just want to remind everyone that the amendment rejects deep cuts to education funding that the majority has proposed. Higher education creates opportunities for students to attain more schooling, to find good jobs, and increase their earning potential. Federal student loan programs support millions of students and helps them afford a higher education. Pell Grants in particular help low and moderate income students access education. In fact, over 6 million undergraduate students in fiscal year 21 put higher education in reach. Our economy needs more students to complete college, but we know the cost is prohibitive. But the college education expands opportunity and boosts workforce productivity. This is offset by, this is deficit neutral, so I would hope that we would adopt the amendment and maintain our funding for higher education and other education programs.
I thank the gentleman. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Scott. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Yes, sir, Mr. Scott. We request a roll call vote. We will roll into the roll call vote, but we're going to put them all together after we get through this last amendment. I'd also yield now to the ranking member.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to submit the following in the record. Letters to both of us from the American Federation of Government Employees, as well as the AFL-CIO, a letter to House and Senate leadership from 170 national, state, and local organizations, a statement from the Alliance for Retired Americans, and a statement from Maison, a Jewish response to hunger.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, ma'am.
I'd
Sheila Jackson.
I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record an article from the Texas Tribune dated July 28, 2023, scared out of my mind of family scrambles after their disabled 3-year-old loses Medicaid. And this is a story of a child that does not sleep, has autism, congenital heart failure, cerebral palsy, and as I said, an autism, and her Medicaid was revoked.
Without objection. So ordered.
And Mr. Chairman, before, if I could have unanimous consent for a moment, before I vote against your budget, I understand that your birthday is right around the corner, and I didn't want that to be what I gave you for your birthday. So I hope everyone on the committee on both sides will join me in wishing you a very happy 39th birthday. That's all we have.
Happy 39.
Happy birthday, Mr. Chairman.
Wow. It says, in case you can't read it, reverse the curse, balance the budget.
That's not, that is fake news.
Appreciate you. All right, that is awesome. Well, I invite all members in our conference room to cut
Yeah.
into that cake with me.
I see it's inscribed with red ink.
It's got red ink. And
My bipartisanship is just remarkable.
well, I appreciate your partnership and friendship in this endeavor. We may disagree and sometimes wildly, but it takes a good ranking member to set the tone. We've set to have real constructive conversation and debate. I think the American people are well-served, and I'm grateful for the passion on both sides and the spirited debate. So thank you all. And there are outside groups that supported this budget, and since we're doing some submissions for the record, without objection, I'd like to submit this list. I'll just read off a handful. Americans for Prosperity support this resolution. Citizens Against Government Waste, Cato Institute, Consumer Energy Alliance, Economic Policy Innovation Center, Freedom Works, Heritage Foundation, Numbers USA, Texas Policy Foundation. There are several others, but I'm going to submit that for the record without objection. Let's go to the roll call votes. The roll call vote on amendments. Without objection, the amendments debated by the committee earlier will have been considered in two en bloc votes, and all postponed votes will be voted en bloc as followed. Vote number one, consisting of amendments 1, 4, 6, 10, 1, 4, 6, 7, and 10. Vote number two, consisting of amendments 2, 3, 5, 8, 9, and 11. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. McClintock? No. Mr. McClintock? No. Mr. Grothman? No. Mr. Grothman? No. Mr. Smucker? No. Mr. Smucker? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Good? Mr. Good? No. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman? No. Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Ferguson? No. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore? No. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes? No. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean? No. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach? No. Mr. Yocum? Mr. Yocum? No. Mr. Burkeen? Mr. Burkeen? No. Mr. Edwards? Mr. Edwards? No. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle? Yes. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky? Yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? Aye. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee? Aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters? Aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee? Aye. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett? Aye. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta? Aye. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton? Aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee? Aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar? Aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant? Aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat? Aye. Mr. Chair?
Chair's no.
Mr. Chair? No.
Are there any members who wish to vote? If not, the clerk shall report. Such a moment of suspense, don't you think?
I think I know which way it's going to go.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 15 ayes and 19 nays.
The nays have it. The amendments are not agreed to. The committee will now vote on the second en bloc set of amendments. Clerk, if you'll call the roll, please.
Mr. Norman?
No.
Mr. Norman? No. Mr. McClintock? No. Mr. McClintock? No. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, no. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, no. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, no. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, no. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean, no. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, no. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, no. Mr. Boyle.
Yes.
Mr. Boyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky.
Aye.
Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, aye. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee, aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Chair.
Chair is a nay.
Mr.
there any
Grothman.
He's a no.
Mr. Grothman, no.
Any members who wish to vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 15 ayes and 19 nays.
The nays have it. The amendments are not agreed to. Since there are no further amendments, I recognize Mr. Burgess from the great state of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee adopt the budget aggregates, functional categories, and other appropriate matters.
Questions on the adoption of the budget aggregates, functional categories, and other appropriate matters. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Would you like a roll call vote?
Later.
Okay. Pursuant to Committee Rule 10, I now call up the text of the concurrent resolution on the budget. It is identical to what was distributed yesterday. The legislative text incorporates the budget aggregates, functional levels, and other relevant items as previously agreed to. I recognize Mr. Burgess from Texas for a motion to order the concurrent resolution reported to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee on the budget order the concurrent resolution on the budget to be reported to the House with the recommendation that the resolution be adopted.
Questions on ordering the concurrent resolution on the budget to be favorably reported to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Mr. Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Norman.
Aye.
Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean, aye. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Boyle.
No.
Mr. Boyle, nay. Ms. Schakowsky.
Nay.
Ms. Schakowsky, nay. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, nay. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, nay. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, nay. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, nay. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, nay. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, nay. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, nay. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee, nay. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar, nay. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, nay. Ms. Ballant. Ms. Ballant, nay. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, nay. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, nay. Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, aye.
Are there any members who wish to vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 19 ayes and 15 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2025 is ordered favorably reported to the United States House of Representatives.
Mr. Chairman, I ask the requisite number of days to submit minority views.
Without objection. Without objection, so ordered. I note for the record that a quorum is present. I would like to ask members to remain for a few more minutes. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming corrections and to calculate the remaining elements required in the concurrent resolution prior to the filing of the concurrent resolution. Folks, this concludes today's business. I appreciate everybody's sincere and impassioned input, and this committee now stands adjourned.